Good morning. Good morning. I'm Marcy Driscoll, Dean of the College of Education at the Florida State University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2011 Dean Symposium. And this is our 5th year doing this event, and we started it back in '07 because we wanted an opportunity to create a forum for all kinds of folks to talk together about issues facing education. So school district people, state folks, education researchers, and students. And it's just delightful to see all of those groups represented in the audience today, including some of our alumni and retired faculty. So very excited to see all of you here. Florida, as most of you probably are aware, has been at the forefront of education reform. Perhaps not always in the most positive sense of the term, but certainly we've been out there. And we are a state that collects more data than probably any other state in the nation and about students and student achievement and teachers, and we've done it for much longer than other states have. So the College of Education, in some respects, is situated very nicely to take advantage of the fact that Florida is a state that collects this kind of data and has been at the forefront of education reform. So it provides us a unique opportunity to address issues about the uses of data in education decision-making. I think most of you are probably aware that in the 2009 legislative session, the legislature passed Senate Bill 6, which was focused on issues of merit pay, teacher evaluation, and so on. Governor Christ vetoed the bill, and then in the 2010 session, the legislature passed what's been called Son of 6, Senate Bill 736, which was tweaked a bit from the original bill. A couple of things taken out of it, but largely remaining much the same. It requires teacher evaluations to be based on student performance, as measured at least in part by annual FCAT scores. And it put this mandate on districts to develop teacher evaluation plans, particularly for the purpose of awarding merit pay. We focused last year's symposium on value-added models of teacher evaluation as the latest tool that has captured the imagination of legislators. These models attempt to account for the effects of variables such as general intelligence and poverty, and to isolate the contribution that teachers in schools make to student achievement. Quite ironically, on May 26, 2010, which happens to be my birthday, the Louisiana legislature enacted a bill to authorize value-added methods as a means to reward strong teachers, identify successful pedagogical practices, and provide professional development to weaker teachers. Value-added models have also been used in that state to examine the effectiveness of teacher preparation programs by looking at the effect of teacher candidates on student achievement. So in fact, one of the things that happened is that some of the teacher preparation programs were in a sense rank ordered on the basis of the results of value-added models. And it caused those programs to really begin to look carefully at the way in which they were doing teacher preparation in the state. The state university system deans, education deans in Florida, have been looking at what value-added models mean for our own programs. And earlier in the year, we invited the primary researcher from Louisiana to meet with us to talk about the kinds of models that have been used in Louisiana and to what effect. Like our legislators, we are interested in tracking how well our graduates are doing to facilitate student achievement, and perhaps how we can improve our programs to become even more effective. It seems prudent then to better understand how these models can be applied, what they can tell us about the impact of teachers on student learning, and how districts have fared that are attempting to use such models. So that's the subject of today's symposium. I'm very pleased to welcome both researchers, practitioners, and all of you to the discussion, and hope that it proves to be interesting, provocative, and most of all, informative and useful. Before I yield the podium, I do want to thank a whole host of folks that helped to make today possible, particularly the organizers, Professors Carolyn Harrington and Betsy Becker, whom you'll be meeting a little bit later, as well as their core of graduate students without whom we could not make this happen today. Our staff, Amber Smalley, the Director of Communications, and the members of her staff, as well as other members of the staff of the Dean's Office, especially Steve Connor. And of course, all of the participants and speakers, especially the teachers who have taken their time away from their classrooms to be with us. Although I did learn on my way in this morning, I passed one of our middle schools, and the crossing guard was not in her usual spot. So I was like, oh no, it does mean there's no school today, and came in to learn that this is a professional development day. So it's perhaps a little bit easier to get teachers, but the folks we have I know are very, very dedicated, and it is a struggle for them to take time away. And finally, I want to mention that this is the kickoff to the College of Education Week. This is the first time that we've attempted a whole week's worth of special activities. So every day this week, we have events going on to showcase interesting and exciting things going on in the College of Education. We hope that this will be the first year of many, opportunity for us to attract back our alumni to engage with us, not just with sports and social events, which are fun, but also to engage with us on academic topics of interest to us all. So now, at this point, let me turn the program over to Betsy Becker. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcy. And it really is great to see everyone here today. I'm going to do an even briefer thank you, which is to thank Carolyn again. Marcy attributed the organization of the symposium to me and to Carolyn, but really Carolyn did most of the work. I got the cushy job of calling and inviting in speakers. And so I'm going to do my job here this morning of introducing one of the speakers. And that's Dr. Dan McCaffrey. He is a senior statistician at RAND Corporation, and he holds the PNC chair in policy analysis. Dan's background is that he is a mathematical statistician, and his dissertation was on a quite technical topic in the area of non-parametric regression, which he did at North Carolina State University. But more recently, his efforts have been focused largely on value-added modeling and interest in teachers. In 2007, he was the lead author on a report that RAND Corporation did for the Florida Education Association entitled Merit Pay for Florida Teachers. So he's been thinking about this for quite some time. The report laid out a number of critical issues for implementation of merit pay, and well, it's yet to see whether our legislators will pay attention to the kinds of concerns that he raised. He also currently is overseeing RAND's efforts to develop and validate models for assessing and improving teacher performance. This is funded by Gates Foundation. He's also co-principal investigator on a project funded by Institute of Education Sciences to develop alternative value-added models of teacher effectiveness. And his talk today is titled, Does the Choice of Value-Added Model Matter? So let's welcome Dr. McCaffrey.
Good, thank you, Betsy, and thanks to, let me just see. All right, where am I? Do that for you? Yeah. Great. Good. View, let's go to view, full screen. Full screen, great. Okay, good, and thanks to both you and Professor Harrington for inviting me here to speak today. I am going to talk a little bit about the choice of value-added models and then try and tie that into the context of sort of what does the choice matter, and sort of what we learn about models, what does that imply for sort of thinking about how we should use them and concerns we might have about what they mean. So, good, it works. I wasn't sure if the keys were going to make this work. So, policymakers, as both the dean said, and I'm sure you're all aware, value-added modeling is quickly sort of being absorbed into the state of business as usual in education. It went from an idea that was really just a concept less than a decade ago to now something that's really sort of everywhere and quickly being enacted with Race to the Top and just lots of large districts putting it as part of their teacher evaluation system. it's going to be part of the current state of business. But the policymakers who are implementing this still voice a lot of concerns about what models they should use and whether the model choices matter. I've done a lot of consulting with various states that are working on this, and one of the things they're always asking is, what model should we choose? How do we make this choice? Do the model matter? And so it's a really ongoing concern they have, and I think there's really two things that are backing up that concern. One of them is that they're really worried that if they don't choose the right model, that the models are not going to fully separate out the student background characteristics from what we're trying to learn about teachers. And really the whole goal of value-added modeling, as opposed to just creating average scores for teachers, is to separate out what's the contributions of the students from what are the contributions of the teachers. The other ongoing concern that's sort of constantly brought up is sort of whether there's really enough stability, whether the estimates are precise enough, or there's too much error, too much noise in them to make them useful. And so, they're really worried about both those things. So we're going to talk today a little bit about how does the model choice really influence both those things, and does the choice of model really matter? So there's really two parts behind that. One is, do various models change what we learn about teachers and what we think we've learned about teachers, and are those changes and those things significant in a way that might make us behave differently? So one concern is about bias, or confounding. Are the characteristics of the classroom, are they sort of combined in with what we think we've learned about teachers in a way, so that two teachers who were really equally effective at promoting student learning achievement would, if one was teaching in a sort of class with a lot of economically disadvantaged students, would that teacher systematically have a different value added than the teacher who was equally good but was teaching a class with students who were not disadvantaged? And the problem with this, there's a sort of not a real clear picture that's evolved here. And one of the reasons is that we can't directly, empirically know whether or not this confounding exists. If we could know it exists, we'd remove it. But the problem is the kind of data we have doesn't let you clearly separate out those two factors. So lots of research has gone on and done things that are very clever, I think, to try and figure out and get at the heart of this without being able to directly test it. And one of the more interesting studies was conducted by Tom Kane and Doug Steger. And what they did was that they took teachers and they paired them up in pairs in schools. And in the first year, they observed them just as they normally would be assigned classes. And they estimated value added. And then the second year, they randomly assigned classrooms to those teachers within those pairs, re-estimated value added. So now the classrooms were randomly assigned to the teachers, so there couldn't be any specific matching of students to teachers because of the random assignment. And if the value added was not confounded, the value added from those 2 years should be very similar. And what they found, it was pretty similar, not as similar as they want. So they needed a coefficient of 1 to say there was no confounding at all. They got a coefficient of around 0.8. It wasn't distinctly different than 1, but it wasn't really exactly 1. So there's pretty strong evidence that there's not confounding, but it's not completely clear. They've also done, another thing people have done is they've done tests. So you can test the model assumptions, and if these assumptions hold, then you can feel more comfortable that there wouldn't be any confounding or bias. And when they've done these tests, mostly the idea is you sort of take a teacher and you see whether the teacher predicts her students' previous outcomes and their growth in previous years. And the current teacher can't have causally influence what happened in the past. So if you're seeing strong relationships there, it would be an indication that there was some sort of potential for bias. And again, in this case, they sort of, several people have done these tests, including Tim Sass, and some colleagues who used to be here at Florida State, and they found that they could always reject that the model sort of met the requirements necessary for that. So again, now in this case, here's some evidence that there's probably a lot of potential for bias in the estimates. Another example where people did some comparisons, what they did was they sort of said they took classes and they went around a large state and they said, gee, some of the classrooms look like the students were randomly assigned. As you look around the classes in that school, there's really no distinct variation across the classrooms in the percent free and reduced lunch, percent minority students, or the average test scores. And so then they estimated value added among those classes. And then there were other classes where there were pretty big differences in the distributions of students across the classes. It looked like the classes were sort of not randomly assigned. And they estimated value added there. And then what they did was they compared how variable the teachers were in those two groups and found that the groups where the classes looked like they weren't randomly assigned, the teachers were more variable. So it looked like some of that variation among the students across those classrooms was still sneaking in and still being part of the value added. So then again, now we have one example with the random experiment where it looked pretty good, like there wasn't confounding. We have two other examples where it looks like there probably is confounding in the estimates. And so this kind of leaves people with a sort of unclear picture, which is one of the reasons why I think policymakers continue to sort of fret about this concern. But also I think one of the problems here is there hasn't been a real clear discussion about what models were used in each of these studies and a real clear thought given to how did those models influence what was learned. And one of the things that keeps going on that people keep worrying about is like, should we or shouldn't we put in student demographics in the models? And I think here in Florida there's actually legislation that legislated what exactly would be in the model, which is kind of a step on why this is important, And the concern is, well, look, we know that whether it's a good or bad thing, we just know it is a fact that students from lower income families, students of color, that they are all sort of tend to score lower on tests. And if we don't account for that, are we going to be conflating that with what we think we're learning about teachers? So should we have to account for that to make sure we're not sort of getting an error in what we're learning? But then the argument against it tends to be along the lines of issues that, look, are we going to be giving a signal that we expect something different from different kinds of students? And there are very technical concerns about fitting the model, that if different ways we might fit the model, if we make these adjustments, we might actually wind up sort of introducing some bias and penalizing teachers who would be teaching certain kinds of students. So, but again, there really hasn't been any large-scale empirical studies that have really compared these models in a very systematic way and said, well, does it even matter, and should we really be worrying about this? The other thing that people worry about is, how stable are these? How much error is there? Is there too much error in these to sort of say anything good and really learn something about teachers? Are we just going to be, are we basically just sort of putting out a bunch of noisy estimates, a bunch of statistics that really don't mean anything because there's so much error, and we'll just be making mistakes? And one of the ways people sort of explored this in the literature is they've looked to see whether whether there's stability across time and teacher value added. So you estimate teacher value added in year 1, you estimate in year 2, and you see, are they generally similar? And what they find is it's not that similar. There's a lot of year-to-year variation. So if you take teachers who were you take them in year 1, you rank them either in the top 20% or the top 25%, then you go back and do it in year 2, somewhere between about 36 to 57% of teachers sort of remain in that top. And it's about the same at the bottom if you sort of look at the bottom. So if we sort of said, okay, from year to year, if we were just going to identify teachers in the top or the bottom, we'd be identifying the same teachers. We wouldn't necessarily even be identifying the majority of teachers over those 2 years. It's really important to remember, though, this year-to-year variation depends on lots of things. One of the things it depends on is, we're just mixing up kids, right? A teacher has a set of students, and there's idiosyncratic information those students bring, and that just causes, whatever we learn about the teacher this year is sort of independent and part of those students. But there's also a part that's sort of, even once you account for that, there's like year-to-year variation that sort of exists at the classroom level. And there's section to section you go across classroom that lives at that level. So there's some information at the aggregate level we need to be thinking about, we need to be worrying about. So now, the goals of this talk then are to say, okay, if we look at value added from different model specifications, are we going to learn something different? Are we going to say something different, at the level that might be important? And then also, given that there's no way we're going to get around there being errors in these estimates, what are the implications for those, and what should we be thinking about, and kind of what ways might we address using these things? So what we've done is, what we've done is we have data from 6 large school districts, and I focused on grade 8 math. On grade 8 math is kind of a challenging situation. I think in the data we've looked at, often we see some of the greatest amount of differentiation across classrooms tends to be in 8th grade math. There's a lot of sorting at that point where you start to track students. The students who are moving ahead are moving into algebra and geometry. The students who are lagging behind, maybe taking pre-algebra or even something before, and there's a lot of differentiation. So this is a sort of tough case for value added, but I think that was kind of good. We've made some simplifying of choices to sort of keep things simple. We only focus on students with a single math teacher. A big issue all around everywhere is sort of how do you deal with students who have multiples. We're going to take that out here to keep things simple. We're only going to take students who completed the 8th grade math test in the current year and the prior year. So we have at least one prior test score for all the students. We've got 6 districts. 3 of them, the data is from the 2009-10 year, and 3 is from the year before. What we do is when we do our modeling, we include all the teachers who are teaching any of the students in the sample math, but I'm going to give you summary statistics that only focus on teachers who have at least 10 students used for their value added. And that just helps get rid of some really, really small classes. And it's a real policy choice to what do you do about teachers who have very small students. But in terms of us really learning what we do, I think sort of focusing on these teachers with more students helps stabilize what we're learning, and sort of it's not just driven by these sort of teachers who have 1 or 2 students. And I think in the end, people will probably have to come up with rules to sort of deal with those teachers separately. I'm going to study, we're going to talk a lot about sort of what happens as we include different background or not background. So the background data we have is sort of their gender, race indicators. We have whether or not students were eligible for free and reduced price meals, English language learner status, and a special education indicator. We have 3 years, so this data is really nice in that all 6 of these districts we have at least 3 years of prior achievement for these students. One of the nice things about having 8th graders is because now we test kids in grades 3 to 8, 8th graders have a lot of prior achievement. In most of these states, we have 2 tests each year in math and in English, so we have 6 years of prior achievement. In 3 of these districts, we actually have 12. We have math, English, reading, and science, I'm sorry. So we actually have 12 tests in 3 of the districts. So we have a lot of background, lots of tests, and I think that'll be really important because one of the things I'm going to stress is that using more tests is an important part of the modeling. So what we do is we're going to fit a model where what we do is we take their current year math score and we predict students' current year math score using a bunch of their information we have about. We have their prior tests, we have the student variables, which we'll go back and forth on what student variables we include, and then we have indicators for the teacher. And so what we're doing essentially is we're making this model sort of predicting the students, accounting for their teachers, predicting how well they should do, and then sort of taking the sort of average of sort of how well people do relative to those predictions, and those become the teacher effects. When we're fitting the model, we're accounting for both the teachers and the background at the same time, which will be an important thing to consider. The models we compare, we have a full model that has all the prior tests. It has gender, race, free and reduced lunch, special education, and English language learner. The second model we're going to talk about is the model just drops out free and reduced lunch. It's the same as the full model, but we just take out free and reduced lunch. Then we have a model that sort of goes back to the full model and drops out the demographics. So there's a lot of concern. Should we put in these kinds of things? So we're going to specifically head-to-head compare those. Then we have a model that instead of using all 3 years of prior tests, just use one year of prior tests. It keeps everything else, all the demographics, everything else of the full model, but restricts to 1 year of prior tests to get a sense of how valuable are additional tests. And then as kind of just really just a worst case model in a sort of comparison to sort of say, well, what if you really sort of did something cheesy? We have the model that just has just 1 year of prior tests. It doesn't have any of the other information, just 1 year of prior tests. And sort of this is kind of the sort of really depleted model. So the first thing I think that's really important, so now we fit these various models. What I've done is I've taken the estimates sort of with the full model and compared them to each of these alternatives. And so we get the correlation between the value-added estimates from the full and the value-added estimates from each of the alternatives. I think one of the things that sort of jumps out right away is that for each of these 6 districts, whether or not we include individual students' free and reduced lunch status, individual students' demographic variables, essentially has no implications for what we think we're going to learn about teachers. The correlation, oh man. The correlation between models with and without demographics, with and without free and reduced lunch, and the full model, once we have all those prior year tests, is essentially 1. So if we were to look at those, the scatter plot of those, they would look like a line and you'd see almost no variation on it. If we took the teachers who we classify and say, okay, let's identify the bottom 10% using the full model. And now let's classify the bottom 10% using either the free and reduced lunch, the model without free and reduced lunch, or the model without demographics. I think when I went across here, I think there were like 4 teachers across all 6 districts who weren't classified the same way using those models. So basically, we're learning, for the kinds of things we want to do, essentially exactly the same thing. So keeping in those models, those individual level information really doesn't matter. When we start deleting tests, we start to see a bit more differentiation. It seems to vary a little bit more across the different districts, whether, how much information we lose by reducing the tests. I think that has something to do with how good the tests are, how related the information on the tests are, and that varies from state to state and from district to district. And when we get back down to including only one test, we have sometimes a fairly large difference to the full model. The other thing, if you compare these to the last two columns here, it's a little, not as completely direct comparison, but you can kind of see that the correlation with the full model is sort of weaker when we go to just one prior test than when we have sort of prior tests and the other information. And so it's sort of saying when we get down to having one test, then it might matter more. If you really only had one test, adding individual level information probably has a little bit of an impact, as opposed to really null impacted here. But by and large, those individual indicators are really not what we should be worrying about in terms of changing teacher effects. But that's not the whole story. So this, I'm going to show you a bunch of plots that look like this, so we'll take a couple minutes and walk through it. So what I've done here is I said, okay, I fit value added using a model with no free and reduced lunch, and those are red. So for each of the 6 districts, those are sort of the red symbols. That's the model with no free and reduced lunch, and then the blue symbols are the model with the full model with everything in it. And then what I've done is I've classified teachers into the top quartile of teachers or the bottom quartile of teachers according to their value-added rankings. I've done that with both models. And then what I did is taking those teachers, I found the percent free and reduced lunch in each of those classrooms. So now I get the average percent free and reduced lunch for the teachers who have the highest rankings on the value-added and the lowest rankings on the value-added. And what we see is if we look at the teachers who have the highest ranking, those are the triangles. They're down here with classes, let's look at District A. They're way down at classes that on average have about 20% free and reduced lunch students. Now we take the teachers who are classified as having the lowest value added, and they're up there at about 0.6 average percent free and reduced lunch. So what we're seeing is a very strong relationship between the estimates of value added and the teachers' average percent free and reduced lunch. So there's a strong structure here. And this is a strong enough structure that if we gave these estimates out to teachers, and we did this for a year or two, they would be a very clear notice. They would notice very clearly that, hey, if we were flagging all the teachers and giving them bonuses based on being the top quartile, they would notice pretty quickly that all the schools where the kids are more affluent tend to be getting more of the bonuses. Because that's really strong. Now, it's not completely consistent. It's only showing up really strongly in 4 of the districts, but it's showing up very strongly and very consistent. The other thing that's really important, this is true with the full model or the model without free and reduced lunch. Again, dropping free and reduced lunch doesn't matter here. But even our full model, this would be a model that people would sort of tend to think is a pretty good model. We have lots of prior test scores, we have lots of things in it, and we're still seeing this big kind of relationship. We also see it with prior achievement. And again, this is really strong in District A. And District A is it's a maybe worst case scenario. This is a district that is has really diverse populations, some very high income schools, some very low income pockets of their population. And they do a lot of sorting of the kids in their classes into schools. So, but what we can see is, we're seeing this is scaled. So this is 1 standard deviation in student scores. So we're seeing like almost a full standard deviation difference between the high and low groups here in District A. And again, it's still, in most of the districts, continues to persist even when we go with the full model. So even though we're measuring 6 to 12 prior achievement tests, we're still seeing this kind of relationship. And this would be something that would be, I think, potentially very disturbing. Now, so does that mean that value added is wrong? Well, it's not clear whether it means value added is wrong, because there's really 2 potential sources here. It could be that teachers who are really more capable, more effective, get to go to schools which are sort of more desirable places to work. They have more, more engaged parents, more engaged students, and so what's happening is that the teachers are being sorted, that the better teachers are winding up with classes of the higher achieving students, the more economically advantaged students. But it could also be that there is something wrong with our model, that even though we have all these prior achievement tests, that's not enough. That maybe peers matter. Being in a class with lots of high achieving students enables students to actually score better. Or that schools really matter, and that schools that have more affluent families just have more resources, different kinds of things. Or the neighborhoods matter, and they bring in more resources. So we need to, it could be that the measurement error in the test is just making it so that we aren't really making the adjustments that we really want to make. But it does indicate that this sort of correlation exists. All right. Oh, right. I wanted to make one point here that I forgot. That this, the really bad case here is a case where we're doing the model with only the prior achievement tests. I forgot that this morning when I wrote this too. So the red model here is the model with just the prior achievement tests. So you see, when you really aren't accounting for many achievement tests, that's when you really see a problem. Accounting for more achievement tests helps and can reduce that, but it doesn't make it go away. Sorry about that. So one of the things we might want to do, since we're seeing these kinds of correlation, would be to sort of control for some of the aggregates, because maybe some of these aggregate things matter. Like I said, when you look at the sources of error across years, there's a sort of aggregate component, so maybe we should be controlling for that. There's also people who really believe, there's a lot of studies out there that suggest there really are peer effects, and if we aren't accounting for peer effects, then we're really capturing a classroom effect rather than a teacher, so we need to sort of sort that peer effect out. So the model I showed where we had those sort of teacher variables and the student variables in the same model, you can't do that input in classroom level variables. It's just a fact of how the statistics work. So we changed our procedure where now what we do is we sort of fit a model without the teacher indicators, but we put in aggregates for the classroom, average prior year score, percent free and reduced lunch, percent minority. And then we sort of fit that model, and we sort of fit in, we get the predictions, we see how students did relative to the prediction. Those are called residuals, and we average those residuals up, and that gives us our estimated teacher effect. So now what we see is, remember the previous slides where we saw that there were big differences, and that's what the red ones are. Again, that's our full model where we include these. Now what we do is now we include these aggregates, and now when you include the aggregates, you see that there really are almost no differences between these. So it's really, whether or not you include aggregate information about students seems to have a really large impact on what we think we learn about teachers. And in a very specific way, it changes whether we see the value added being sort of correlated with the prior achievement, correlated with FRL or not. It removes this not only for prior achievement and FRL. So those are pretty much the same. One of the things, though, it doesn't really matter which of the aggregates we put in there. It's not the fact that we're putting in aggregate free and reduced lunch. It really is, again, if we just put in aggregate prior achievement, we see the same thing. So mostly, we're getting this out. If you sort of fit a model where you put in achievement and average prior achievement, you really get most of what you're getting. Adding free and reduced lunch, whether it's at the individual or the student level, doesn't matter. Same with the basic demographics. So basically what you see here is this is a model where we have the full model with everything in it, and then the blue, and then the red one is a model that just drops the free and reduced lunch at the individual and group level, and they're essentially identical estimates. Now, there are reasons to sort of say, okay, so we're thinking, okay, let's just jump into this and do it. We should always include aggregates. There might be some reasons to be concerned with that. Again, it's a sort of technical issue. Remember I said we're now using this different way of fitting the model, where we don't account for teachers when we do the fitting. And so if it was the case that teachers were sorted and sort of more effective teachers were teaching classes with fewer economically disadvantaged students, with more high-achieving students, and we did this kind of correction, we may actually be correcting out part of the teacher effect. We may sort of say, well, gee, those good teachers, we'd say, well, that looks like the student part because we haven't let teachers sort of be there to protect themselves when we're doing the modeling. So we could introduce some bias in that way, and so we would actually sort of be penalizing the better teachers. So maybe there should be some correlation, and as you saw, once we've done this modeling, we've stripped it all away. We don't really know what that should be, so it's something that's hard to do. There are some fixes for this that we can do with more data and more assumptions. You have to model multiple years of data or go across multiple sections. One of the problems there is that you'll often see that that really requires that there's variation from year to year or section to section in the background and the characteristics of students that the teachers teach, of the students that the teachers teach. And we don't often see that. For example, one of the districts we've looked at, the correlation in the prior achievement from year to year was 0.85. So they were really teaching very similar kids across those 2 years. Same with their race characteristics were very similar there. So it's something that, you know, we can probably do something better than sort of what we're doing, but it's going to be hard to get very stable estimates. So in summary, at the student level, it really doesn't matter that much whether we include free and reduced lunch. And we should probably include those in ways that is important for other purposes. But even our models with lots and lots of achievement are showing this kind of correlation with the background characteristics of the students. Including the teacher level things matters a lot more, but it can result in bias if these teachers were sorted. And, but we may be able to use section level information for secondary teachers. It'd be a little harder to figure out what to do with elementary school teachers. So now, one of the things that I've ignored to this point is the fact that all these prior achievement tests are measured with error. So when we estimate a test, the test only has so many items on it. We don't test everything the student might know. We don't use every item we can. The students sort of take them on one day. They sort of learn what they know today, what they've learned this year. So there's a lot of fluctuation in those errors. And those errors can actually be very large, especially for students who are getting almost none of the answers right or getting almost all the answers correct. In those cases, the errors can be like 3 to 5 times greater than for students who are getting somewhere sort of, near the middle of the distribution of students. And these errors can be large in the sense that they may be as large as about 40% of the variance in the error, standard deviation of the error, may be almost as big as the variance across students altogether. So it can be really quite a large error. And if we don't account for that error, our models can be fit incorrectly. And we can sort of not account for the backgrounds of students correctly. And we can do it in a way that what happens is, if there really are students who are different students with sort of lower achieving classes will sort of not be adjusted correctly and will sort of penalize teachers for that. They will not sort of know how low we should be predicting those students, and when they don't do as poorly, when they do more poorly than the model suggests, it's because of measurement error, and then we penalize their teacher. But the conventional wisdom has been that sort of adding lots of tests is the way to fix this. And so what we can see here, what I've done is I've said, okay, now we have 3 districts where we actually know the measurement error of the test. We actually have information on the measurement error of the test. These are districts A, B, and C, and we have their measurement error. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on those 3 districts at this point. And what I've done now is I've showed you, okay, so the first model is a model with just one prior test. So the idea is if we add it has one prior test and all the demographic information. Now if we add more tests, the idea would be that we'd sort of override that measurement error and hopefully maybe break this correlation if it shouldn't be there. And what you can see is in 2 of the districts we're seeing that we are definitely getting some bang out of doing that. That sort of using more tests is valuable and does reduce some of those problems due to measurement error. And in one district, it sort of fixes things completely. In that district, I think what's going on there, I think they are probably using the test scores to do a lot of their sorting. And there's a more uniformly, across schools, this is a more uniformly low-income district, and there's not as much heterogeneity. But it's very interesting that we do see in that district it behaves a little differently. Now, the next thing I've done is I said, okay, so now we've also been working on models where we're dealing with specifically sort of saying, look, we know there's error in this test. Let's fit a model that accounts for that error. So we have a model where we just put a bunch of tests. We put one test in, that's red. We put a model where we put all the tests in. These are 12 tests here, so 12 tests. And then we put a model where we say, we know we have measurement error, and we're going to account for that measurement error just using 6 of the tests. And what you can see is that accounting for the measurement error even further breaks down this correlation. And sort of in most of these districts breaks it down to the part where it would be fairly weak. Although those differences are still kind of noticeable, the correlation is now pretty modest in this case. So we still see differences, but we've really reduced them a lot by sort of accounting for measurement error. So accounting for measurement error seems to be something that would be a real benefit, and it's something that's pretty doable. So now, up to this point, I focused all about this sort of confounding and bias, but I also said way back that policymakers are really worried not only about the confounding component of it, but also are these things so noisy and so much error-prone that we're really never going to learn anything if we use them. And what we find is that they have fairly large standard errors. That those account for trying to think about what it means to have large standard errors. That if you sort of think of the variation among teachers, that the sort of what we're thinking is error in those estimates is about 25%. So So, you know, the error is about 25% of as big as all the variance. So that's pretty big. It means that we would you know, have a lot of error, and there'd be lots of variation among the teachers, even relative to what the real spread would be. That doesn't include the estimates with the aggregates. Also, one of the things is adding student covariates really doesn't change this very much. And we need to remember, again, that the standard errors alone, sort of, they only measure sort of how much error we think about getting this year's estimate. But if we're thinking about how stable things are and trying to sort of get something that's more about what we're really learning about a teacher that's sort of stable rather than just her performance or his performance this year, then there's actually this extra error that's sort of this year-to-year bopping. And so to look at that, what we've done is we've compared estimates from one district. We only had sort of good, clean data from 2 years from one of the districts. So I've got estimates from one of the districts, and we have them in like 2008 and then again in 2009, or 2009, 2010, I'm forgetting right now. So basically we have 2 years of value added for one district, and we sort of found the correlation in those 2 years of value added. So if they were really stable, these correlations would be 1. And if they were really unstable, they'd be 0. So the idea, this district actually has pretty good year-to-year correlation. It's just much higher than most places we've seen. I've done this in several places, and usually you find correlations more in the order of about 0.3 to 0.4. This district, we're finding them up around 0.6. So this is a pretty high, high correlation here. But one of the things I think is very important is, again, these are our models. We have our full model, the model where we drop free and reduced lunch, the model where we drop demographics, models where we use just smaller numbers of tests. And what you can see is sort of dropping those demographics again. That doesn't influence our reliability. That doesn't make the year-to-year correlation better or worse. So really, again, there's nothing here over here. It's not like, okay, well, it doesn't fix the bias, but maybe it makes them more reliable. Doesn't. Sort of controlling for those individual background characteristics other than test scores doesn't matter. A little bit of noise with the tests. And I think what's going on is the tests help soak up a lot of these things, so we really are just getting more uncertainty about the students that's sort of flowing in there. But again, where we see the big difference is whether or not we include the aggregates. And it's really interesting here, including the aggregates is a penalty in terms of being less precise. So there's kind of two things going on here. One of the things is, like I said, remember, this district has really strong correlation in the kinds of kids teach from year to year. So suppose we really let that be part of what we call the teacher value added. Suppose all the things about the students were in that teacher value added. Then those things would be stable from year to year. So we'd see a really strong correlation from year to year just because the part of the error would be strongly correlated from year to year. That we'd sort of be saying, what is this teacher, would be their students, and the students are the same from year to year, and we get this spurious, strong correlation from year to year. Now when we put in the aggregates, we take that piece out, remember? And so what happens is we see that the year-to-year correlation goes down. Also, the modeling to include those student information sort of, I think, makes these estimates less stable over time as well. So we've kind of got sort of the part due to statistical error that sort of makes them lower, and then the removing the bias, which we kind of want to do, that makes them lower. So you're seeing that there's a, you know, it doesn't matter if we adjust for things at the kid level, pretty much doesn't change things. If we adjust for kids at the classroom level, they fall. Now these are not giant changes here, but it is kind of a notable difference. So far now I've talked about, okay, do we have bias? Do we know we have standard errors? We know that sort of putting in the kid stuff isn't going to matter. We know that sort of counting for aggregates does. But now let's think about how are we going to use these things, and what are we going to do with these? So what's the thing we want to do? Well, basically, I think the number one thing people are thinking about doing, or the ways they're talking about doing, is we're going to take these estimates, we're going to rank teachers on these estimates, and we're going to take groups at the top and the bottom. We're going to say, you're identified as being exceptional at the top, and we're going to do something with you. You're identified exceptional at the bottom, we're going to do something with you. Maybe we won't tenure you, maybe we'll dismiss you, maybe we'll identify you for professional development, maybe up here we're going to give you bonuses, awards, make you master teachers, have people come and sort of follow what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to sort of rank them and create these groups. The goal is we want these groups to be really distinct. We want the teachers at the top to really look different. We want them to be doing better things. We want them to really be having students who are achieving more. Down at the bottom, we want to make sure that the teachers we have there really are the teachers whose students aren't achieving well, who aren't succeeding in being effective at promoting student achievement. Now, okay, so if we knew the real teachers, and we knew their real effectiveness, and we sorted the teachers on that, we'd get big groups, right? So if we ranked up our teachers and we sort of said, okay, we really know who's truly effective and not, and we sorted them and we ranked them, the people at the top would be really different than the people at the bottom, right? Well, now we don't have that, right? We have these noisy value-added estimates where I just told you there's pretty substantial noise, and in different studies it varies how noisy they are, but there's a lot of variation. So what happens if we rank them and sort them based on that noisy thing, but what we really want to do is find out the teacher's truly effective? Well, basically what happens is the groups mix, right? So now instead of having a group that's purely the lowest performing teachers, we have some of the lowest performing teachers and some of the higher performing teachers who got unlucky through the errors in our value added. And up here, the group would be some of the highest performing teachers and some other teachers who got unlucky, or I guess maybe lucky, depending how you're looking at it in that case. So, so what happens is they mix. So all of a sudden, the differences will not be as pronounced as they were if we knew the real value added. The teachers in the top won't be the ones who will consistently, across the board, across time in themselves or across each other, consistently have high achievement. There'll be some mix. But one thing that's really important is they don't go away. It's not like we now have a mush and the teachers at the top and the bottom don't look different at all. It turns out that they actually remain fairly largely distinct. And how close they are depends on that reliability, that sort of year-to-year correlation in the estimates of the teacher. So the stronger that is, the more we're going to separate them. And it really is at the square root of it. So if you have a reliability that's even pretty low, let's say it's 0.35, and some studies we did with Florida data suggested that the year-to-year correlation was more in the level of 0.35. So that sounds really low. But if you take the square root of that, that's about 0.6, So and if it's a 0.4, the square root of that's about 0.66, about 2/3. So if we took the bottom 10% of teachers out, knowing these really are the bottom 10% of teachers, then under some assumptions, what we'd see is that the mean for the average teachers would go up about 0.2 of a standard deviation unit. So an effect size of about 0.2, the mean would shift up, which would be big. If you can shift up things by that in education, usually we're pretty happy. So that would be a kind of big shift. If we did it with the true, that would be that big. Now, if we used our noisy estimate, instead of getting a bang of 0.2, we'd get a bang of about 60% of that, about 0.12. If we used 3 years of data and averaged them together, and then we did this, we would get our reliability up to about 0.6, and then we would sort of take the square root of that, it'd be about 0.75, and so we'd get about 3/4 of what we would get. So again, using noisy value added, we don't sort of lose everything, we just get inefficient. So if we knew the real thing, we'd get more spread, but we still get pretty sizable spread, and it sort of goes down more along the lines of sort of the square root of the reliability than the reliability. So all this look at the reliability may have caused us sort of over-sensitive and sort of over-concerns, but we will separate out the groups. However, that may not be the whole story, right? Because that tells us if we separate the groups, we will get teachers who really are different. But we're going to do this year in, year out, right? These processes are not sort of measure a teacher once every 5 years and kind of gather a bunch of data. It's kind of do these things every year. And if there is a lot of year-to-year instability, that's going to create a lot of decisions that change from year to year. And this is going to create a lot of uncertainty for the teachers. And it could really create uncertainty about, a teacher thinking, look, I'm coming in here, there's sort of variability, uncertainty in what I do. That could hurt the sort of desirability of the teaching profession. That could make it harder for people to make choices and decisions, not knowing, what I'm making this year, was that going to exist? It also is going to sort of create what I think could create what I would think would be like a sense of capriciousness in the measure. That the teachers would say, look, this goes from year to year. How can something I do change something that appears to be a bouncing ball, random event? Which could weaken teacher expectancy, the belief that the teacher can actually do something that will change that measure. And it could also reduce teacher buy-in. People are not going to feel very comfortable about sort of agreeing to sort of be measured by something that they think, it's sort of a random choice whether they get to be top of the heap this year, middle of the heap, or bottom of the heap. And so but buy-in and expectancy have been shown and stated to be sort of really important for things like pay for performance to sort of have their effects and sort of change the way teachers behave. So lead teachers to actually want to make changes in their behaviors, they've got to believe they can do something, and they basically have to buy into that measure. So if we start to sort of weaken that by having a lot of this year-to-year churn, we may start to weaken the ability of these systems to sort of have their achieved goals, which is to change teaching. And that's just if we have error, just random error at all. one of the things, if we have bias, if we have these things where teachers in certain kinds of schools, we have this sort of systematic relationship between the errors and value added, that could sort of create some of its own problems. Because then what we'd see is that teachers at the low end schools, low SES schools, let's see, we have the kind of correlation we were seeing here, they could get less recognition. They would be as high performing. They'd be more likely to be turned over, more likely to leave. It could sort of create a sense of unfairness across all the schools, that they believe that, hey, this really isn't sort of separating out the schools. Kind of some of the same problems we hear that people report about the perceptions of value added. And in fact, this is even showing up in some of the articles about DC, where there was one article I saw where teachers were commenting, oh yeah, you know, the bonus just sort of all went to all the teachers in the high-performing schools, just like always. Again, this could then weaken the perceived fairness of the measure, and that's required then for again, one of the things that is thought to be required for things like pay for performance to achieve their results. Again, it could exacerbate notions in these kinds of schools about the measures being fair, getting buy-in, whether teachers can really make a difference. You know, if you really say, hey, look, it's just the students you teach, that's all it is, people are not going to feel that they can make a difference. Again, it can make the uncertainty greater in these schools that are sort of more have low SES and sort of make them less desirable places to work. The other thing is, this is a sort of subtle point, is that if we have this bias, one of the things that sort of seems to be a way to sort of work our way out of this, some of the error problems, is to average things across time. That sort of stabilizes things, right? We sort of, well, maybe you got lucky this year, but if we average things, it will stabilize them. But if we have the bias, then averaging doesn't do that, because a teacher in a low-income school every year is going to be hit by this, you know, an error in a similar direction. So 5 years of data is only going to make us more convinced that teacher really wasn't doing that well, when really it was just that that teacher never got to a different kind of school. So should we worry about errors? Yeah, they're going to cause us some loss of efficiency, so we want to do things. It's not as terrible as I think, you know, we talk about, oh, this year-to-year stability, that just kills us. That's probably a little bit of an overstatement. The efficiency we're going to lose is going to be sort of not quite as bad as that, but it will create this. Bias would be sort of a bigger concern, is that it's going to make it harder for things to average away, and it's going to have some of those, create some greater inefficiencies, and where the inefficiencies occur are going to be more targeted. They could dampen the utility, especially if we allow for all this year-to-year churn, weakening expectancy, buy-in, and the sense of fairness across the schools. So if we want to reduce things via modeling, we're not going to do it by sort of worrying about whether or not we should put free and reduced lunch or demographics in. They're not going to change things. They might change they might change stakeholder buy-in. Teachers may feel better or worse if you are not controlling for these kinds of things. And so maybe we should sort of tune them to that sort of thing. There's the perceptions, maybe we should use those to manage perceptions, but are they really going to change what we learn about teachers in an empirical sense? Probably not. Controlling for aggregate demographics seems to be the way to go if you really want to make some of these changes. They may introduce this bias in the opposite direction. My hunch is, and this is a hunch, so you should sort of discount this greatly, is that that bias is probably smaller. I just don't think the sorting is all that great, because one, we don't know that much about teachers, and two, it's just, no one has ever said, you know, this correlation is that great that it would do that. I could be wrong, but that's my hunch. The other thing is, if we start doing these, we may get things that are less stable over time, so we may have to sort of work harder to deal with that. One of the ways to sort of bring down these errors is to combine data over time. So we might combine multiple years of data. It's not clear how many years of data to combine. Now, if we really think we're only interested in long-run things, we want to combine lots of years. But I think everyone's hoping as the system evolves that teachers will be progressing over time. So we want to sort of be combining data over time in a way that allows us to identify that. So we wouldn't want to combine 10 years of data so if the teacher was really distinctly different over that decade, we'd sort of never be able to see it very well. So there's some trade-off there that needs to be sort of, I think, studied more carefully at this point. One of the other things people are really interested right now is combining value added with other measures. So they're saying, okay, we've got value added and it's all its sort of warts and ugliness, but let's sort of go in and measure teachers with observation information and sort of combine those. Well, a couple things with that. One, those observation measures are sort of unreliable in their own right. Two, the things that we've been looking at, various studies have been doing this. The MET study, Measures of Teacher Effectiveness, which is going on by the Gates study, has done some looking at this. We have some of our own data we've been looking at this, and it looks like those things don't always sort of line up that well with what we're learning about teachers' ability to effectiveness to sort of promote student learning. It looks like maybe there really is something distinctly different. There's a sort of method effect. Sort of observation things seem to tell us something slightly different. So it doesn't mean that pulling them with the value added isn't useful. It just may not be as useful as some other information. And in particular, prior year value added seems to be the one thing that seems to have the most information about current year value added. And the thing that sort of, if you really want to sort of get more out of your value added combining across multiple years. We could try some of these other things we know about teachers, credentials and those things, but again, they really aren't very good predictors of value added, so sort of putting them in and trying to use those to sort of help leverage and sort of average out the error won't do a lot. But sort of exactly, you know, how much information is useful and when should we do this, when should we include this? This is something that still is an open question and actually some work that we're doing on one of our projects. So what are some like maybe 5-second guidance things? So I think you should definitely account for measurement error and use multiple tests. I wanted to sort of, I missed the end of that bullet, sort of include multiple tests. You should adjust for demographics based on what's really valuable for stakeholders. You need to be somewhat sensitive to the potential pitfalls for counting the classroom demographics or prior achievement. You know, there's potential bias, there's more error in it. Really, I think we've got to be thinking about using multiple years of value added and somehow using that to smooth things out and in a way that still might allow us to sort of see changes over time, but also is using the multiple information. And we need a system that's sensitive to the negative consequences in the churn, so that accounts for that negative consequences of the churn. So we need to try to do something to reduce the uncertainty for teachers and try to reduce that sense of capriciousness. This is sort of more opinion than anything I've known really in hardcore research. I don't think there's anything out there that really tells us specifically how to do this. You know, the things that statisticians tend to sort of put in to try and reduce those things is you use significance testing. We do things that account for the error. Like I said, you use multiple years of bad ratings. You know, if you really are in the lowest group, you have to be there 3 times. I think Louisiana, I think the dean mentioned Louisiana, I think their rule is that if you have 3 like lowest ratings as a teacher, then they sort of put you in this sort of probation bin, and then you have 3 more years to sort of improve yourself. So, you know, they're using something where you're not going to be sort of one rand bad thing won't hurt you as much. Might include multiple measures in the decision making. It's not clear that sort of combining them to a single numeric composite may be the right way, because they may be telling us something distinct, and it may be more useful for people to sort of see both sources of data so they can think about how those distinct things. One of the things I think in the Charlotte Danielson literature, if I've read this correctly and remember it accurately, is really this idea that teachers should be in part of the evaluation process, and the teachers should really have a voice in this. And then my thinking here is that, you know, if they're part of it, it's harder to sort of feel capricious if you really are able to sort of look through the process, look at the data yourself, and really be part of it. It also seems that maybe allowing for human judgment, for principled judgment, could be a way to get around that. It doesn't seem as capricious to give people information and then let someone sort of sort through it as it does to sort of have a very algorithmic way that feels like, you know, if by bad luck you get a low number and then you're just kind of burned. On the other side, I think one of the concerns with principals doing things is people have always been concerned that principals' choices could be capricious and somewhat there. So again, figuring that out will be something that we need to do as we move forward in this space. And that's it. I don't know. Great. I can do that. Great, thanks, Becky. I have the first one.
Yes, I'm very concerned about one of the first points you made, that the lower the percentage of free and reduced lunch students, the higher the value-added scores. Because the state of Florida, the whole selling point is that the value-added score is supposed to level the playing field, so that sort of thing doesn't come that much into play.
Right, I think that's a real important thing, and I think one of the things, now let me say a little bit about Florida's model, which I know something about, but not everything about. Like I haven't ever seen any comparisons of their model against these things. So one of the things is the models I'm looking here are not specifically and exactly what Florida is doing. So it may be that Florida's models are capturing some of these things. And Florida is doing a few things that I think might help to reduce that correlation. One, they are accounting for measurement error in their model, and they are putting in a few classroom level aggregates into their model. So it may be that their model wouldn't show exactly that kind of characteristic that we're seeing here. But one of the things I would say is that you probably want to know, and probably I think it would be reasonable to ask that the state demonstrates that you don't see those kinds of correlations, that they provide something that sort of demonstrates that their model doesn't. And I know when the vendor who was developing this did lots and lots of checks of their model, lots and lots of specifications, and they probably have somewhere that kind of information, so it might be useful to make sure that that kind of information was a technical report. But in fact, I want to be clear that I don't know that the problems I'm seeing here do exist in Florida, and it's given the kinds of things they've done, it would seem like they may have actually fit a model that would probably have reduced some of those potential correlations.
Florida doesn't include free reduced lunch as a co-variable, but so did that model, right?
Yeah. But they've done some of the other things. Like I said, they've dealt with the measurement error, and they've put in some classroom level aggregate kinds of things, which, as you remember, those things really help to break that spurious correlation, or potentially spurious correlation. Yeah, good. I'm glad you brought that up because I did want to make sure that it's clear that I'm not saying that this would necessarily be true of Florida's model. Any other questions? Yep.
Thinking back to this idea of dropping off the people who are on the low end of the scale, and you're saying something about sort of modest improvement. That's assuming, aren't you, that you're just have the remaining pool of teachers then would be at the upper end of the scale, and not that you're replacing that bottom 20% with new teachers who are in the early part of their learning curve.
That's right. That's a good point too. So the number I quoted, that you would bump up the remaining pool by 20%, that's who's left. But now you're short teachers, so you've got to fill back in. And when you fill back in, you will be filling in teachers who kind of run the whole distribution. More of them will be earlier in their career, which will downgrade things. Now, people have studied this. There's a paper that people studied this where they did a very extensive simulation and sort of said that you should trim a really ridiculously high percent of teachers every year to make this work. I did some quick and dirty kind of simulations just to get a general sense of what direction this would go. And even if you're filling in sort of teachers from the average, and even if you're filling in teachers who kind of in their new year, you sort of say when they're newly hired, they're going to be kind of lower performing, you still do get benefits to the overall distribution by doing that. That eventually, by going fairly low in that distribution, you're sort of weeding out more low-performing teachers and the teachers you're weeding out tend to be, even with error in your value added, they tend to be sort of low enough performing that the people you're filling in for them, you still bring the overall distribution up. You're right, though, it weakens how well that does it. But again, the little bit I've done and looked at that suggests that it doesn't weaken it so much that would not overall bring up the overall average teachers. Ignoring, again, two really key assumptions. One is that you can actually replace them with anybody, which may not always be true, and two, that there are no other negative consequences, that this kind of changing the way people are hired and sort of weeding people out with this kind of algorithm doesn't change people's interest in being in teaching. It doesn't change the pool either positively or negatively. But so you sort of assume everything's the same, and you do that, it could have some positive. So it's not exactly clear what would happen, and then I think, I don't think we really will know until we've tried it, which I think we're going to start seeing pretty soon. It'll be hard to know.
You haven't mentioned anything about class size. Now, of course, my experience is lower elementary, but if you put 30 kids into a class, that is without an aid for the teacher, that is a big burden on the teacher, also the students and parents. What do you say for large class sizes?
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't really looked specifically at how these things vary by class size. So I don't know how much value added really varies by class size. I just haven't looked at that specifically. That's something I haven't really focused on. I do know that some people put that into their models to account for class size, and Florida does. Yeah, I think so too, having just read that. That is one of the things they do account for here in the state. Yeah, I really can't say how much that matters. I do know that sort of when they've looked at things like changing class size, they've had sort of, some places have had stronger and weaker results on that, so.
Going back to the idea of firing that bottom group of teachers, isn't that also assuming that the model is theoretically sound enough to correctly identify those as truly being the bottom teachers?
No, that's one of the key points, is that you can have error in who you classify as the teachers, and what's going on is that you just have to have enough signal in there so that the people who you would be removing would be significantly lower performing than the people who you'd be replacing them with. And so you can have, and one of the things that I think is very important when people talk about, oh, there's all this year-to-year variation, that must mean value added isn't giving us a very clear picture. It's actually, it's not as bad as that it's really sort of more on the sort of square root of that. So it's sort of, it's only, you know, it's not as strongly downgraded as it would be. So yes, you know, if we knew precisely, we really knew teachers who were really less effective and we put them in the bottom 10%, we would really shave them off, and then our concerns about who we'd be replacing them with would even be weaker, because look, we were really pulling off some really low performing teachers. But as the value added gets noisier and our information about how low performing teachers really is gets weaker, we just sort of making that group less pure. But it's still, even though we have a lot of error, it's still generally much lower performing teachers than the rest of the distribution. And it's sort of, as that error gets really weak, it gets less and less differentiated. But at the kind of error levels we see, there's still sort of pretty substantial amount of differentiation, which is, I think, one of the perceptions that I've kind of had over time that's really been evolving in my own head, is that that differentiation is stronger than I think most of us perceive. That doesn't affect this point, because basically, and this is another thing that I think is kind of somewhat counterintuitive. What we're doing is we're just getting rid of we're just murking up that group of teachers we're shedding off, and the bias just sort of says the group of teachers we're shedding off tends to be teachers from a certain kind of school. So, but it doesn't change the fact of how close we are and how similar we are to the teachers we really have, provided we really have an accurate estimate of the reliability and things. So if the reliability really is about 0.5, then we will know that the sort of murkiness of that group will be such that we'd sort of be only about 60% as efficient as we would be if we really knew the true thing. Whether or not what would happen, though, is the teachers down there who are being sort of put in there incorrectly are all going to be teachers at schools sort of teaching lower income students, which I think has its own set of implications and problems, but it doesn't change the nature of the fact that we still are sort of shedding off teachers in about the same amount of sort of murkiness in that group. Yeah, it takes a while, so it took me a long time to sort of get that clear.
It's interesting that in your kind of tips or takeaways for some of us, you have the, give teachers a voice, allow for principal judgment, which sound softer than some of the statistical points that you make. Do you see any possibility or potential, I guess, for maybe
Well, there's kind of, in terms of sort of, I think the idea is we want to make distinction, the idea of sort of creating a measure of teacher performance using student achievement, and sort of getting that and sort of providing that with the information about the quality of that and the potential errors in that, and giving that to people. And then the process of actually using that information and how that information is then put into a system. And I think it's in the second part of that where you can have more flexibility in thinking about how is that used and how is that information going to be presented to people, and then what kind of training are we going to give people, and what kind of rules and guidance are we going to give people about using it. And there, I think that's where the qualitative things are going to come in. I mean, I think one of the things I think most of the states are now thinking about using value added, they're definitely thinking about providing some sort of observation as another component of what they're doing, and how they're going to present that and give that to people is something I think is still very up in the air. And I think some states are thinking about providing guidance, and other places are more laissez-faire and sort of saying, okay, we're going to give back this information, and then the districts will sort of come up with their own plans for how to use it. But I think I personally, and sometimes I go back and forth of whether this makes any sense or not, but it feels to me like the ability to sort of give information to people and then allow people, human judgment, to be part of the using that information seems to be, if we look about how other decisions are made and people in other places use decision in ways that seems effective and can compensate for all those sort of higher dimensional things that we just can't get out of those numbers clearly, it feels like that's what we've used human brains for in the past, and it would seem like the way we'd want to use them here. But then there's also the side that sort of says, look, people make a lot of mistakes, you have biases, you have preferences, you have all these concerns, and should we be providing stronger guidance using the empirical things to get over those kinds of errors, human errors? So I don't know, and and there is this concern. I know that there is been a pressure, and one of the reasons we have the sort of very standardized things we do with teachers is to avoid the kinds of capriciousness that human judgment has led to. So it feels like we need to introduce human judgment to get over the capriciousness of the models and the sort of statistics, but on the other side, we need the statistics to get over the capriciousness of human judgment. And I feel like I need to sort of learn 10,000 more hours of sort of studying something else before I can talk clearly about that.
probably wouldn't come out very well on some of these types of numerical attempts. I also don't see in any of the things that have been happening in education for quite a few years that we ever talk about the role of the student, the obligation of the student to learn, to have parents who support the desire to learn. None of that's built in. It's like everything's dependent upon the teacher, regardless of whether society's out there doing the right thing, or the family's doing the right thing, or the student is doing the right thing in terms of their own responsibilities. So how do you reconcile this type of thing with all of those other factors?
Yeah, I think I kind of, from my own, personal thinking about this more than any data I have is that was my point, is that you think about the way this is developed and sort of thinking about something as a profession, it's not clear to me that the signal we'd be giving, I mean, one of the theories that's sort of about using value added for pay for performance is that it will improve the teachers who want to come into the field, that this will somehow energize and change the people who are sort of inspired to come into teaching. And I've never understood that theory of action. Sort of going to something where my evaluation seemed like it would be more capricious isn't appealing to me, but I'm sort of risk adverse, and I wouldn't like that. But maybe, I don't know, but maybe there are other people who have that, or I'm not really understanding what that whole argument is. But I've always worried that it would have more of these negative consequences for the points you're saying, that in ways it would weaken people's ability to see that they're going to go into something where the full depth of what they do would be intriguing. But I think one of the other things is there are beliefs about evaluation systems that if you provide solid evaluation and we have a greater idea about evaluation and professional development sort of hinged on evaluation, that there might be ways to be more effective and that you can have evaluation and sort of encourage people to feel like it's part of a growth process that is encouraging. But I think it really depends then not only what we use as a measure, but how those, again, back to how those measures are used. In terms of the how the students contribute, I mean, the goal here mostly is to sort of try and statistically account for the differences in the students and sort of take those out. But I think one of the points you bring up is a kind of interesting one, is what kind of signal are we giving to families and students and people? Are we creating a system that is sort of pushing back enough of that responsibility and sort of encouraging as a society, sort of saying we should expect that our students come and our families come to schools with expectation that it's a bargain and we're both contributing, rather than sort of saying it's all about evaluating the teachers because we've got to throw out the bums and sort of then kids will be doing better. So but again, that's kind of not an area of expertise, but it does feel like maybe something we need to think about. We need to. I think Betsy's giving me we need to move on.
I'm giving it the signal. I think we should probably go on for maybe another
I don't know what happened. They're just going to.
It went to sleep is what it was.
I'm Carolyn Harrington, and again, welcome. I think one of the great things about the Dean's Symposium is the fact that we have a lot of different experts, and we have a lot of different experts in different places. We have experts up here, and we have experts in front of me. And the richness of the discussion we've just seen is one of the wonderful characteristics of these symposia. So keep the questions coming. We've just heard from a researcher, statistician. For the next hour, we'll be hearing from a practitioner. At the end of the day, we'll be hearing from teachers. And it is a large community that produces learning. There's no question that students and teachers, perhaps the largest co-producers of learning, but in fact, it's a very large community, and we need to have this kind of rich discussion. Florida, as the dean mentioned earlier, is distinguished by the amount of data it collects on a systematic basis on its students, its teachers, its school systems, and it has been doing this for a long time, really dating back as a legislative priority to the 70s, and then the mechanics of the system was developed in the 80s. The computer technology greatly expanded the capacity, and now Florida is really awash in information about its school system. I often bemoan that Florida is data rich and curiosity poor. Given how much data we have on our students, I'm often concerned that we don't have enough research going on to pull from that information. A number of the questions we just heard over this last hour, questions that we still don't know about the relationship between student achievement, teacher performance, and a host of other issues as well. I'm proud to include today in our agenda, our program, Superintendent Tom Townsend from the Putnam School District. He has been recognized by his peers and by the state of Florida for his innovative use of data to drive instructional improvement. I'd say this is an example of a leader in Florida taking advantage of the data that we have and using it to pursue what we all are interested about, which is improved student learning. Florida has to the rest of the country, an unusual system of selecting superintendents, while the large urban school districts, the superintendents are appointed by the school boards, which is the case in most of the rest of the country. most of the medium-sized and smaller districts in Florida, the superintendents are elected by the people, and it has proven to be, I have systematically tried to evaluate if one system seems to be better than the other, and there's absolutely no evidence that one system is better, but there's no question that elected superintendents often share different characteristics than appointed superintendents. Superintendent Townsend, a former businessman, a stay-at-home dad. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience and a breadth of knowledge and experience to his job as superintendent. And I think you'll see this leadership, this energy, this innovation in what he's done within his school system. So please join me in welcoming Superintendent Townsend.
Good morning. As you heard, I didn't take the traditional path to become superintendent. As a businessman, I had my own nursery and commercial landscape and irrigation company, and had a situation that was just too good for my family to pass up, me to be able to stay home with my young children and take care of my aging parents, which put me in the schools a lot. And it put me in the schools in a different perspective. And that perspective led me to believe I could do something about improving our schools, which led me to run for school board, which, I don't know, this thing just keeps on going, and here I am today, and I don't know how that quite happened. But I know that as I listen to the questions, the thing I think matters most is the human factor. And I think we forget that too much, that everyone in education has something to contribute. And one of the questions about, what about the student's responsibility? I think is very relevant. We're going to get into that. But student growth, it matters, and it truly does. But I think the debate is, what is it? Is it the teacher? You know, is it the administration? Is it the community? What is it that matters? Well, I think it all matters. Today we're going to be talking about Putnam County specifically, and how we've used our data to drive our instruction and our plan. We're going to talk about what we did, our values, because I think the values matter a lot. All this talk about collecting data and how do you decide, you know, throw the bums out. Well, I don't think anybody wants to do that based on numbers. You have to have your values. You've got to ask questions, and we've asked lots of them, hard questions, ones that sometimes we didn't like the answers. Your answers have to have sources. They just can't, you know, they can't just be opinions, because we're going to create a environment of collaboration. Then we've got to create an environment of trust, and that means you're going to have sources for your answers. Plan of action. You certainly can't do anything without a plan of action, and you're going to need stakeholders to build that plan of action. Here's probably the toughest question we had to ask. Where are we? It's great to, particularly in these small rural communities, these are your friends, these teachers that we talk about. They're your neighbors. In many cases, they're people that have taught us lessons that we can't measure. But at the same time, student growth matters. We want our children to have equal opportunity to go to the best colleges or to be in a position where people invest in them. And where are we going? You know, that's something I think is left out of the discussion way too often, is where are we going? We can talk about where we are and we can identify that, but where do we want to go? In Putnam County, we believe that every student we should expect a year's worth of growth. That's a lot easier said than done. But if you believe that, then you've got to take a look at whether or not you're doing that. And then you have to put together that plan of action to get you there. When I came into office a few years ago, we came into the perfect storm. Now, I think only a politician would think there's a silver lining in a perfect storm. But I did. Here I came into outside the institution. I came in with a $14 million projected deficit in Putnam County, air of distrust, a focus on get more for less, and who do we blame? But I tell you, when you're in that perfect storm, you don't have anybody else to look to but each other. And I think that's what we have done in Putnam County, and it hasn't been easy. There's been a lot of fighting. We've had a trend of declining enrollment and parent involvement. That is to say that every year in Putnam County, I think for the last 10 years, we have lost students. for a variety of reasons. Economic reasons, people searching jobs, moving elsewhere, homeschooling, virtual school, just a variety of reasons. But with that, funds leave us, and we lose our scale of economy. It's difficult. Parent involvement, our successful kids and those parents that are involved, they're going to succeed no matter where they are. I don't think it matters if you're in Putnam County or Tallahassee or Michigan. These are people that are driven, that know how to work a system, and it's going to work for them. But in Putnam County, our parent involvement was dependent on that, and many people just felt alienated from our system and still do. Mentioned the shortfall. Our declining ranking on state assessments in reading and math. We have for many years, I think the last 6 years, we have declined relative to our neighbors, our fellow districts, to where we're close to the bottom in the district. That's a hard thing to stand up here and tell you, but it's probably the first thing you have to do is make an honest assessment of where you are. I am very pleased that we reversed that trend this year and we're starting the other way, but we're just getting started and we have a long way to go. Our schools, we had 20 schools operating in isolation. That is that the leaders of those schools, supported by the district, really had their own culture, what they decided, their own curriculums. And that made it pretty tough because, and I'll be the first to tell you, if it weren't for the fiscal crisis, they'd still be operating that way because it's pretty easy not to be responsible if everybody's doing their own thing and you're just supporting them. But given the fiscal crisis, it's made us take a look and said, you know what, we're going to have to do better. We're going to have to provide professional development in a way that reflects where we are. In Putnam County, we have a lot of mobility of students and teachers. Well, it simply doesn't make sense to have different professional development at different schools for different strategies with people moving around all the time. And we simply did not have the money to sustain that. So we changed that and brought what we call our single district culture, a curriculum, Success for All, throughout the district. And boy, it came with a lot of heat. But we knew that we did not have the money to train everybody consistently and sustain it. Our teacher evaluation system focused upon aligning teacher practice with student performance. Student growth matters. And at the end of the day, it is the outcomes that matter. How we get there matters too. But it does give us a measurement. It gives us something to look for that we have to ask. And it can be different in every county. It can be different in every school. But if you don't ask yourself what you expect of student growth, then how do you expect to get there? That is what we've done with our evaluation system, but it must inform instruction. Too often I know coming in, and I get it, I understand. I know what my intent is, but if someone was coming in and looking at me and comparing me to numbers, and they're using at the end of the day, in our case we use FCAT scores, after you have taught, that's kind of tough. You know, last night I was watching the World Series, and I don't know if anybody saw it, but Mr. Jackson for the Cardinals was pitching a pretty good game. And they took him out in the 6th inning, 1 out, 2 on base, and they put in another pitcher. And the first pitch is a home run. Well, I can tell you, my baseball career ended at 12 years of age, but that was a bad decision. But it's a little late to be talking about it after an outcome is there. Is what are we going to do to make sure that we make those right decisions along the way to increase student growth? I don't believe we talk enough about that. I said we had to take a real hard look at us. And anybody that wants to, if you go to the Putnam County School District website, we've built lots of applications that has made us face our reality. Here's one of the applications, and if you're a district in Putnam County, you can put your own district in and use it. It's interactive. It's a lot of fun. And what you see, the red line is Putnam County, and I think we're talking about reading here, all of reading in 2009. And you can update this to be relevant. So we asked ourselves, okay, we've told ourselves forever we're poor, that's a fact. We're one of the poorest counties. I think when it comes to child poverty, we may be the poorest, but we're certainly in the very bottom. But we're not stupid. Poor doesn't mean stupid. So we took a look at where are we. And then we said, and that's where that red line is. And then we looked at our neighbors. That's where the blue line. And I think it's human nature, and that's kind of what we're really talking about if we're going to move education forward. How do we get humans to interact with one another for a common goal? And I can tell you, I believe, and I've always believed, I'm as good as my neighbor. I think that's just who we are. Well, that blue line up there, St. Johns County, is right next door to me, and I have a real hard time thinking that I'm that far away from the best district in the state. So that was a real eye-opener for all of us. We took a look at that, and I'm going to tell you, teachers, administrators, community people, we all kind of took a breath. You know, it's one thing to know, we kind of knew where we were, but we, you know, look, we have a large African-American population. We have a large ESE population. We have all free and reduced lunch, I think it's 80%. I've got all the excuses in the world that tells you I belong there. But when you actually look at it and we look in ourselves, none of us believe we belong here. This is math, same kind of results. And we said, what are we going to do? Well, like I said, that's a hard one, and I would encourage you to take a look at where you are and see whether or not you think you belong there. Well, how did we get there? Well, here's a graph that we used that we broke down into grade levels, again using FCAT data. And on this we said, well, we're trying to get all our kids, according to FCAT, to be a 3 or better. How are we doing? The blue line indicates by grade level those that were a level 1 or 2 and moved to a 3 or more. So you increased an achievement level or more. Okay, that's a lot of growth. And you look at that, we know we can teach, or we wouldn't be moving that many kids a whole achievement level. We're not just talking about a little growth, we're talking about a whole achievement level. That's catching them up more than a year's worth of growth. So we know we can teach. But the red line is the regression. We said, wow, that's where it is. That means our 3, 4s, and 5s that have dropped an achievement level or more. So I think we, and rightfully so, we said, what are we doing? Well, we were in Putnam County focusing on getting them over that threshold. You know, you got them over there, let's get another group over. Well, they were coming in the back gate faster than they were going out the gate. So that was very eye-opening for us. And I got to tell you, this was really powerful for our teachers when they saw this. Because then they started asking, like they should, well, what about my students? Of course, this is district data, but we can do this for individual schools, and it really becomes a powerful tool for their professional learning communities to talk about where they are. Here it is in, what are we, math here, all schools, and you see the 6th grade there. Yeah, that was tough. I mean, it really jumped out at you. What do you do? Well, we focused on 6th grade. And I have to tell you, we had this last year, the greatest growth in math in 6th grade than any grade that we had. And it wasn't of anything different that we did. It was focusing on what's going on. We had our 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade this year relative to the state. We're 6th in the state in student growth. Well, I can tell you in Putnam County, we've not been able to say that, I don't think, ever. And certainly that growth is because we were further behind, but we are on the move, and we're very proud of that. And it isn't about administrators, it's about teachers facing the hard fact and not accepting that that's where they are. It's about making sure we line up our limited resources in a way that supports them in a timely manner, and we'll be talking about that. So what do? We dove in. A guy from the outside the institution came in and said, hey, I don't know how we're going to fix this, but I know we have to fix it. We made a very conscious choice to engage one another. And I'm going to tell you that engagement has not been pleasant most of the time. We certainly, in the state of Florida, whether we intended to or not, we have created an air of distrust that is mistrust that's really, it's hurt us. And I think the only way that we're going to work through it is actually proving ourselves, getting in the room, using this data for a way that improves instruction and lifts teachers, and not for a way to say these are the ones that have to go. Because I have to tell you, as we'll get to it, when I look, and we've broken our teachers down into quintiles, it's very easy to make assumptions. And it would be very easy to justify your actions based on numbers. But I don't see anything that would lend me to believe that will improve instruction. Matter of fact, I think it's just the opposite. So, I like this one. We do this every day. We must reflect. And that's all this data gathering is. It's a chance to reflect on where we are and what we want to be. We've made some assumptions in Putnam County. I believe that everyone has something to contribute. Some of it happens to be negative, but everyone has something, and it needs to be listened to. But the very parents, we talk in Putnam County, I think 90% of our citizens do not have anything above a high school diploma. Well, I think if we're going to engage them in true support, then we must make them feel valued. You know, a system that has not worked for them in the past doesn't mean it can't work for them now. And we have done some things in parent involvement that I think are really changing the school culture, the community culture. And people are seeing that they truly have things to offer that may not be the tutoring, but it could be that lunchroom duty or freeing up a skilled worker to do the tutoring that we need. And we're doing a lot of that in Putnam County. We knew that our number one priority, the most important thing is the teacher in the classroom. I can tell you right now, if we keep losing money every year, if you could only have one thing, you'd rather have a teacher in the classroom than you would have a superintendent talking about teachers. It is the priority. Yet we don't treat them that way. And I think that's something that has to happen. And I'm not talking about coddling or putting up with individuals that don't do their job. I'm talking about getting real about what is important. It is that engagement with the teacher delivering instructional practices that we know work to improve student growth. Quality instruction, and we've heard a couple of comments about what a good teacher is. We all have our opinions of that. We've got to define it. Well, in Putnam County, a good teacher grows students. That's a fact. That's what we've decided. That does not mean we don't count the other things that a teacher does. We're having those discussions. How do you make those judgments? A good teacher in Putnam County, we believe, is someone that continues to improve their profession through professional development. But as you see, when we look at scores, I've got to ask myself, if I'm not getting the scores that I want, is it because our teachers aren't performing, or is it because the professional development I've provided? They may be doing exactly what we have asked them and getting rotten scores. Well, whose fault is that? I think that's something that we have to reflect on every day. What is quality instruction? And how do you articulate that? Well, in developing what we call our single district culture, we've picked curriculums and best practices that are research proven. I can tell you, if you have a research proven model and it doesn't work, it's not the model, it's the way you're working it. So it's taken out some of the debate. Doesn't mean we're committed, we can change. But it certainly helps, and I'm very appreciative of Florida making sure that we at least have research-based programs that we put in place. But we went a little further and said we want research-proven programs. I want to know some things that have worked with my demographic in similar areas. I want to know that it's proven. And that way it does allow us to say, stop the talk. This works. It's how we work it. And then, how we evaluate the methodology. We use it as a tool. It is meant to communicate and make people more effective. I was talking earlier, I told someone a hammer is a very effective tool. Smash your thumb with it, though, and tell me what you think about it. It matters how we use this data, how we evaluate people. In Putnam County, we've picked the Marzano model. What we like about that model is it's got us on the same page. These best practices fit very nicely in it, things that are proven, that we know that work. But when I first came into office, one of the things I did was I pulled all the evaluations in Putnam County, 800 evaluations. We had unsatisfactory, need improvement, effective, highly effective, and exemplary. 800. We did not have, now keep in mind, we were one of the fastest declining districts in the state. Okay, we're at the bottom. We did not have one unsatisfactory teacher out of 800. Needs improvement. We had 9. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a diehard Democrat. I can't get 800 Democrats in a room that at least 9 don't need improvement. And I can tell you, most of them would tell you I'm the one that needs the improvement. But our evaluations were worthless. And I talked to my administrators and I said, we don't have a teacher issue here. We have an administrative issue. If we cannot evaluate, if you cannot communicate to a teacher what it is that you want, what you expect, and follow up to see that it's happening, then the evaluation has no use whatsoever. And that's what we're trying to use the model. So now, as we spend lots of time in our classrooms, and we do, but we also have multiple measure points, that it's not just the principal or the AP. We're bringing people in from the outside to also do that evaluation, because if we don't collaborate and make sure that we're consistent in a single district culture across the board, it won't have any meaning. We will allow individuals to be able to say, well, that's just their opinion. So that's very important and exciting too, because I think it's going to raise the game of our administrators to a point that we really are going to be partners with our teachers. And the feedback is fantastic so far. So here's what we know. First, that's a picture of the St. Johns River in Putnam County. If y'all ever want to come and talk about a value-added model, I'll take you out on the river and we can get to what's really important. Student achievement will not improve unless teaching improves. I believe that. And someone has not been a teacher. Actually, I have. I was a teacher for 5 days, a substitute. It is much easier to be a superintendent. But I've seen, it's pretty clear that the continuum is large. Seen excellent teachers, and it's not hard to recognize. Students are engaged. I heard somebody talk about class size. Well, I've seen teachers with very large classes, and the students so engaged it didn't matter. You know, it's a matter of being prepared and knowing how to deliver that instruction and knowing how to build that rapport. Working alone without feedback won't get anybody anywhere. I talked about our model of walking through, and immediately and we've just implemented it this year, so we're going to fall down lots, but we're going to get up and keep doing it. But immediately, as we're looking for the specific practices that we've asked them to put in place, as that administrator walks through, they can give them feedback that is emailed to them. And the most important piece is the teacher's able to give feedback back. Because, you know, the administrator doesn't have it right. It is, you know, you can say, hey, I didn't see, we said we were going to have a common vocabulary for everyone, and that wasn't posted on the board. And the teacher says, well, you just didn't look in the right spot. Here's where we've had it, and here's the reason that we've had it. Those are the kind of things that bring people together. We talked about the continuous improvement of instruction and professional development and feedback, and that really is what it is. You know, and how do you, someone mentioned I guess I mentioned, the FCAT being at the end of the year. We've got to change that model. We've got to start providing some feedback with some data early on, and in Putnam County we have, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And supervision. You know, from the business world, I can tell you, and we've all heard it, you better inspect what it is you expect. You need to be very clear on it, and even though, I can tell you a story, when we first came in to office, my associate superintendent of curriculum went and did classroom walkthroughs. And I tell you, the alarms went off everywhere. What are y'all doing in my classroom? Well, we were walking through and looking, and she had went through 160 classrooms, and she rated the rigor. And what we found, that 40% of our instruction was level 1, direct instruction, 40%. So that was just in her view, you know, with her people walking through the classes. So then we went and got our FCAT data, and we put it up there. Well, guess what? 40% of our students were level 1. Go figure. You know, if that's what you teach, that's what you're going to get. And that was a very powerful tool for us to use with the teachers for a purpose. Not to say that this is a fault, but we weren't looking. No one told them what we expected. You know, no one has even, we're still trying to define what rigor is. But now we're having the conversations. Celebrations, they're important. You've heard me talk about what Putnam County hasn't done. Well, let me tell you, we've done some phenomenal things. One of the 6th grade math teachers this last year, and we'll get to it, averaged over 2 years worth of growth for her students, touched 60 kids. That's phenomenal. I wouldn't trade that teacher for anybody in this nation. Okay, that was one of the same teachers that was not having the results. And it wasn't what we did, it's what she has done with the self-reflection. So what is it? What is it that makes us so good, makes that great teacher great? You know, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about the education profession or any other profession. People have that it quality that sets them aside. And how do you get them to bring it to others? You know, is it the rigor that I was just speaking about, the student engagement, all of that? Some have it in certain areas. Well, how do you get them to bring that to others and in the class? So what we've done in Putnam County is we've been very fortunate in that we've received a TIF grant, a Teacher Incentive Fund grant. And this has allowed us to explore this pay for performance, which, you know, there's many different opinions on it, but we actually this year our teachers will be able to earn up to an additional $6,000 based on how they perform. But we're finding out in the conversations and then bringing the teachers together, it isn't the pay. You know, they want the respect, but more than that, they want the satisfaction of growing students too. You know, I believe they don't want to be blamed for one hasn't grown or they haven't done as well. They want to truly look at it, analyze it, and see what practices we can put in place. How can it be measured? That's the trick. I'm not sure it can, but since nobody else had any ideas, we decided just to throw one out there. And we believe, like you see here, that a good data system is just like a good scale. And I can tell you this, we have a we at the house that you step on. I would suggest if you get a good scale, don't get one that talks back to you. It can be very demoralizing. But what a good scale does, it tells you where you are. It doesn't tell you what you're going to do. It doesn't tell you whether you did good or bad. And I think that's the mistake that we make. We look at data and we make an instant judgment. It simply says where you are. Where you go from here is up to you. Well, we want to be, as I mentioned our neighbor, I want to be as good as my neighbor to the east of me, St. Johns County. Okay? Well, I went to talk to them, took a look at what they did. I understand they have advantages that we don't have. I also understand they're putting practices in place that are very easy for us to model. So you start where you can. And we know where we are, we don't like it, and we're going to do something about it. LGI. You know, I talked to you about being from outside the institution. The reason I just put LGI is education has more acronyms. It took me 2 years before I could even understand what people were talking about. So I created one. This is my acronym. It's the Learning Gains Index. And the Learning Gains Index is simply a measurement. We use FCAT scores, okay? And we use historical data. And we take that FCAT score and we use our progression and regression. We give that some weight because we think it's important that we move all kids. You know, if you've got a class of 20 and you move 5 up in achievement level and you let 15 drop back, well, we're missing the bar there. And a level 3 is not the target. Student growth is the target. Our best students need to be pushed just as well as our lowest students do. So we give that equal weight. We think that matters. So we developed a system that said, how can we do this? How can we take our data that we have, and Florida's done a wonderful job, all that data is there, and how do we compile it in a way that is relevant to us? Because I can tell you, when you look at state data, you can hide. What I've showed you is district data. You can hide. But you start looking at your school data, and then you start looking at your individual data, then you're standing on your own scale, and you've got to decide where it is that you want to be. So what I'm going to show you here is just a static shot. I think this is 0809. And if anybody wants to get with me, we can give you a login that puts numbers on teachers so you can play with this and see how all this works. This is a district snapshot. And what you see is we've split our teachers into quintiles. And if you're looking at the LGI by quintile data, the number of teachers, the average LGI growth at 1.09 is our calculation. Is it flawed? Probably so. But it's a calculation we use for everybody, and it's a measurement. Good or bad, it's a measurement. It includes the progression, the regression, the developmental scale score, and as you keep on going over, you can actually see where the students started on an achievement level. You know, the start was 2.54 and they ended up at a 2.61, and gives you that growth measure. So that calculation, we've put everybody together. Well, it didn't have the impact, and I can tell you, when I looked at it and looked at individual teachers, we saw some really scary stuff that we didn't think. We saw some teachers I knew, that I know are great teachers, but when it came to student growth, they weren't. It just was a fact. So what were we going to do about that? Well, the first thing I did is got scared when they showed me, when Mr. Forster, my assistant superintendent, showed me this. We said it's kind of like an 800-pound pumpkin. It's really cool, but what do you do with it? But we made a decision we're going to share it. But it had to be relevant. And when we first rolled it out as a district level, it wasn't that relevant. So we broke it down to the school level so every school can see where they are. And then we also broke it down to the individual teacher level. Someone mentioned about, what about student responsibility? We're now developing the same model for our students so that they can look in and see where it is. And the measurements we're putting in on that are not just GPA and FCAT scores, also attendance, tardiness, things that we've talked to our business community that they say are very important. They're keeping them from hiring our kids. So our kids, just like our teachers, will be able to go in and see, where do I compare if I'm a 6th grade math teacher to all 6th grade teachers in the district or the state, all 6th grade teachers in my school, and what is my LGI? So I'll tell you a story. When we first rolled this out at a school, we made a mistake. And we threw it up there, and at this one particular school, the bottom 2 quintiles were really poor. But there was the top 3 were really good. And we threw it out there, and nobody really cared because you didn't know where you were. But we inadvertently put the name of a teacher up there, happened to be the worst performing teacher in that school. Yeah, I was mortified and she was furious. I asked her to come to my office to offer my apologies and to speak with her. And as a professional, she said she didn't want to come today. She was, well, I won't tell you what she said, but she was mad. But she did come about 48 hours later and sat with me. And she said, Mr. Townsend, I want to tell you, I am furious about the mistake you made. She said, but the reality is I'm a good teacher. And her historical data showed that. But that year, she was terrible. And she knew what she had done. She didn't share it with me. She says, I knew when I was teaching what I wasn't doing. Well, I can tell you the very following year, she was topped in writing in the school, middle of the pack in reading, and doing great in math. I didn't need to fire that teacher. I needed her to get on her scale and decide where she was and offer the supports that we could. That was very powerful for me, and it told me early on, this is not to be used against anyone. This is to be used for student growth and for our teachers to leverage it. Again, this is based only on FCAT scores. Okay, keep in mind the year's over. I love that. If we take the FCAT in March or April, okay, our principals appoint our teachers in May, and we get our results in June. Now, if a principal tells me, these are all the teachers I want because they're doing a great job, and then the scores come in and they're not, do I have a teacher problem or do I have a principal problem? I mean, that's the dilemma. This isn't, we need a shared focus, and I believe that's what this has allowed us to do. Again, this in itself is a 3-hour presentation, but those that are interested, if you email us, we'll get you a login so you can play with it and ask questions. And we're very excited about what we're doing and would love to come anywhere to show you. Data-driven instruction for professional development. I think this is what we're really about. And these are some of the quotes from the teachers that we've gotten together. And I want to read that. The end product we created is not what has the most merit. It is the process we went through to get there that is of the most benefit. And then the other one, sharing with teachers from other schools. We often have time to share with those at our school, but the other schools we often don't see. I think that's the value of what I have brought, is just an outside perspective, not a better perspective, just a different one. Teachers have it. And one of the discussions that has come up is teachers have operated in such isolation in their classroom as we free them up to walk through other classrooms, even within their own school. We've repeatedly heard, well, I thought everybody taught like I did. We haven't. We have done a disservice to our teachers in saying it is your responsibility and not offering these supports in place and not giving that clear expectations. There are teachers out there that have bad practices. They need to be changed, and we don't need to be shy about talking about it. So we created a data-driven instruction team. This is a team that specifically focuses on the data of our students and our teachers. We have put in interim assessments every 4.5 weeks in reading and math. We're assessing our standards in alignment with our pacing guides and FCAT, and we get that feedback within 3 days, and then we bring those teachers together. And we look at their data, because I'm going to tell you, you can look at state data or district data, but when you're talking about their children, you'll find a profession that is so committed to these kids that it is personal. And I think it's a good thing to make it personal and put that in front of them. And what we're finding out is now, what started out as a, you're after me, you're going to get me, we're now having conversations of teachers, in the case of 6th grade math, where they stand up, and those that have been successful in those interim assessments in real time are sharing their instructional practices with their colleagues on their standards with their kids. It's exciting. If you ever get a chance, we do them 4 days a week throughout our district at different schools. If you get a chance to come, we'd love to put you in one. And one of the things that we want to do is start expanding that, because if we were think about this, if we were to take this data and take the teacher I said, growing kids over 2 years worth of growth in a year, and every school district has those, and you bring those experts in the room, people like me need to get out of their way and listen to what it is they have to say and let them go. Think how powerful that is. We have, with the data that Florida's collected, I think we have an ability that is second to none. But it's so important that I think us as educators start changing this atmosphere, this environment of not about what you didn't do, but how we use this to do what it is we can. And that's the message I'd like to get to the legislators, who I think have put us in a good spot to do this, but the tone has been wrong, and it's been problematic. Our evaluation system is based on contemporary research. Aligns with FEEPS. This is nothing new. These are all best practices, and those in this room know them a lot better than I do. Conform with Race to the Top. Let me tell you, that wasn't any picnic. We needed the money, and we had to sit down with the union, and it's important. And I have to tell you, I worked with a union way back 30 years ago, just as a laborer, and it was great, and I'm telling you that we accomplished a lot. But when it got close to being laid off, they were able to say, back it down. We didn't accomplish anything for a while. And it amazes me, as we talk about private industry, and we need to do private practices. Well, private industry, private business always acts in their self-interest. Well, why wouldn't we expect our union to act in their self-interest? It's a good business practice. And when people are acting in their self-interest for a specific outcome, no one's arguing about higher student outcomes, and we change that tone, I do believe where it's unlimited in what we can accomplish. Conforms with 736 this year. We don't know what we'll have next year. It provides the basis, our evaluation system, for our compensation, in that we're using 51% of student growth as a measure, and we're using this. However, this year, we will start using those interim assessment data for the same thing. And I think that's going to be very important, because you're actually going to see right out of the gate how you're doing. You're going to be able to make adjustments with your students in real time. And that's the piece that's very exciting to me. The Teacher Incentive Fund grant, again, is the basis. And it's something that I think we're going to have to find a way to fund. It is hard enough to give teachers enough planning time now, and the planning time often is not directed. You know, individuals left to their own will go a whole bunch of different ways. So I do think it's important to set a very clear direction and a clear focus on what it is that we're trying to accomplish, and have them do the work. As I mentioned, I went to St. Johns County, and certainly the practices, and there's, you know, we're very proud of our bells and whistles that we have, and we could give them to anybody. It's not the same as doing the work. And that is what I think is the most important. And no matter where you are on the continuum, for me, I'm absolutely convinced that the value is there. That's how you build sustainability. It's how people, recognize and get their own self-satisfaction. They see where they are, and they start seeing where they're going, and they'll police themselves. We're starting to see now, for the first time, teachers talking about their profession and how they can help the others, but at the same time, there's some that won't teach. And I know in this discussion with my administrators, I thought probably the easiest way to improve student growth was to mandate that their children be put in the lowest quartile of teachers at their school. Well, as you can imagine, they didn't want anything to do with that, because it makes us be accountable. It makes us get in that room. It makes you take action. When it's personal, you will take action. And we're focused on continuous development and improvement. Everything we do is not about ripping you apart, but it's about reflecting and how do we make you better? How do we take our resources? And I can tell you, I'm not adverse to dismissing people who either don't have it or don't want it. This past year, we had 2 tenured teachers that we've gone through the process. It's been very cumbersome. But you know what? That is what management should do. And it's what we can. But again, we have 800 teachers. You know, I guarantee you, where you work today, you know individuals that your organization would be better off if they weren't there. We have to face that. We don't have an unlimited source of money, and we need to be practical about what we do have, and we need to be proud about the actions that we take. But we also need to provide that opportunity, the very specific goal of what it is we're trying to accomplish, the very specific actions and professional development.
It's about time to start our afternoon session. Where's Mark? We'll see. Well, it hardly seems possible, but it seems like the attendance has increased since the morning, and maybe that's because people all across campus in Tallahassee have heard what a terrific morning session we had. This afternoon we have 2 more sessions. I can't say 2 more presenters because we have a presenter and then a panel. I'm going to introduce our first presenter of the afternoon, and that is Dr. Joseph Martineau. And I actually knew Joseph, have known Joseph for some time. He graduated from Michigan State University, which is where I taught before I came here. We're really lucky to have him here today because he is the head of the Office of Educational Assessment and Accountability in Michigan. Michigan is one of the other states that's been very active in creating large data sets on their students, and a lot of the input to that data set, that big data system, comes out of Joseph's office. He's in charge of the Michigan Educational Assessment Program. We used to call it MEEP up in Michigan. MEEP is Michigan's FCAT. And it's also a part of the Michigan Merit Examination. He is concerned with assessment of students with disabilities, of English language learners, with accreditation and accountability, and also his office is in charge of matters that connect Michigan's testing system with the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Joseph's work on value-added modeling started in his dissertation, the title of which was The Effects of Construct Shift on Growth and Accountability Models. And he did that work with Mark Recase at Michigan State and graduated in 2004. The work that Joseph did then showed that changes in the nature of what's being measured, such as the way that math differs in grade 4 from the way it's measured and the way it's conceptualized in grade 8, can actually lead to problems in measurement, and of course that can lead to problems when we're trying to measure growth and make conclusions based on our assessments of that growth. Conclusions about whether students are changing, and therefore about whether interventions are working, whether teachers are having an impact, and so forth. Today his title is Measurement Challenges in Value-Added Modeling, so please join me in welcoming Joseph Martineau. I'll let you take over.
thank you, Betsy, and thank you everyone for being here. This is exciting to be here. I'm going to start first by saying I'm just going to assume that Dan's got all the stats right and taking care of measurement error, everything's fine there. We solved those problems. And what happens when there are other kinds of problems in measurement? So I'm going to start with what is a construct. Theoretical definition, content experts usually define constructs with high levels of dimensionality, meaning that there are subconstructs for which there really is theoretical meaning. And each dimension or subconstruct can typically be considered on its own construct worthy of individual study. So for example, in mathematics, you have algebra, you have geometry, you have number and operations, number sense, those kind of things. And each one of those can be considered to be important to study in its own right. So mathematics is not just one big undifferentiated construct. It has many constructs that can be studied as well. However, statistical abstraction, psychometricians and statisticians usually define constructs with low levels of dimensionality. And why is that? Because there's correlation among the subconstructs, and when there's correlation among subconstructs, statisticians typically say, they're measuring the same thing. A combination, well, I fall into this camp. I say that a construct is a characteristic that is theoretically distinguishable, statistically distinguishable, maybe more sensitive than what people typically do in statistics, and that high correlations do not mean that the constructs are indistinguishable. Highly correlated constructs can be differently affected by different interventions. So think, for example, can you think of an intervention that would work well with algebra but would not work well with geometry, or vice versa? So traditional psychometric assumptions about constructed measures include that the measures are unidimensional. That means they're sensitive to only a single construct, just one, they measure only one thing. And that they're on an interval level scale. That means that changes of the same magnitude on different parts of the scale have the same meaning. If a student grew from 8 to 10, that means the same as if they grew from 808 to 810. That also implies that the measures are linear. So I'm going to start with a counterexample in a pretty simple case. I'm going to start out with grade 8 mathematics based on Michigan's grade level content expectations, and I assume Florida has something very similar. This is based on the Michigan Educational Assessment Program, or MEAP. So here we have the Michigan mathematics content standard distribution. We have algebra, geometry, data and probability, and number and operations in grade 8. So this is taken from the percentage that cover each of those in the Michigan grade level content expectations. So theoretically, math is multidimensional. But traditional statistical tests tell us that math is unidimensional. And again, that depends on the claim that because the subscales are highly correlated, it's all just math. So again, the question, are there interventions, including different teachers, that might be good at teaching one of these subconstructs, but not so good at teaching another of these subconstructs? Can you imagine a teacher that might be able to do that? Who might be very good at teaching number and operations, but struggles with algebra? So, from a theoretical perspective, high correlations do not mean that subconstructs, that subscale should be modeled as a single construct. But those are just theoretical concerns. The statistics tell you that you can just treat this all as one big scale. And can you show me an example, an empirical example where this matters? So I'm going to show you an empirical example. So what we did is we created a composite math scale for MEAP, and we placed the subscales on the same scale. It's all just math. Then we ordered students on the composite math scale. We created 100 groups of students with about 1,100 students each. We obtained average composite math scores for the 100 groups, and then we also obtained the average subscale scores of those 100 groups on the 3 subscales, which are algebra, geometry, and number and operations. And we plotted that in a 3-dimensional achievement space. So what you can see is that this is not linear. Students do not progress through mathematics in a linear way. In fact, they tend to learn first geometry before they learn algebra. If you look down on that floor, you can see that progress in the lower end happens on geometry, and then it kind of switches toward algebra. So here's our highest achieving group of about 1,100 students. Here's our lowest achieving group. This 3D composite scale, one of the interesting things is this passes all traditional unidimensionality tests. What does that mean? Statisticians would typically treat this as a single construct. But we see three subconstructs actually behaving differently from each other. And if this truly were, I'm going to skip that, if this truly were a linear scale, just one scale, all of these lines on the floor, on the walls, and through that three-dimensional space would be linear. But they're not. So the important result is that this composite scale changes meaning over its range. It's multidimensional, it's nonlinear, and it's non-interval. And statistical models rely on those scale characteristics. So statistical models that rely on those scale characteristics would result in distorted interpretations here. So the implication is, if scales traditionally considered unidimensional, linear, and interval are sometimes none of the three, how badly affected are the results of statistical models that use those scales as outcomes? And can the powerful statistical models that rely on those scale characteristics be used? So essentially the question is, why should I care whether the assumptions are violated? So I'm going to take you through a simple thought experiment. This is theoretically how badly can value-added model be affected. And I'm going to take you through theory, then I'm going to take you through mathematical approach to this, and then I'm going to take you through some empirical examples in this. So in this scenario, teacher A versus teacher B as a reading intervention, we're going to investigate that. This is a true experiment. We're going to assign students randomly to either teacher A or teacher B. We have a composite reading measure. It's sensitive to both decoding and comprehension, but it's more sensitive to decoding than comprehension. It does not change meaning over its range, and I have a couple known impacts. I know that teacher A increases gains in comprehension. I know that teacher B increases gains in decoding. I know that teacher A has no value-added impact on reading, just average. It's an average teacher. And teacher B has no impact on comprehension, meaning she or he is an average teacher of reading comprehension. So the results should identify both teachers as equally effective, but on different parts of the reading construct. So the next slides give a graphical representation of this thought experiment. So here's our scale. It's a composite scale. It's sensitive to both decoding and comprehension, x and y axis, but more sensitive to decoding because it traverses more of that x-axis. So I'm going to say this is where kids start out for both teachers, because this is a true randomized experiment. They have exactly the same pretest. And now what I'm going to show you is, here we have the normal gains that students make on comprehension. Here we have the normal gains that students make on decoding. Here we have the value added of teacher A on comprehension. So teacher A does a great job with comprehension. Here's the value added for teacher B on decoding. And that's where students end up. So teacher A post-test, this is where students end up with teacher A. That's where students end up with teacher B. We project that down onto that single unidimensional scale, that composite scale, and what we see is that teacher B is more effective than teacher A. So in this simple thought experiment, the results, the accurate results are that teacher A and teacher B are equally effective, but on different parts of the reading construct. Both of them have a strong value added on one part of that reading construct, but the observed result is that teacher B is better than teacher A at improving reading achievement. So some policy recommendations that will come out of that, accurate, well, you might say teacher A needs professional development on instructing reading comprehension, and teacher B needs PD on instructing and decoding. But the observed policy recommendation that comes out of this is give teacher A PD in reading, teacher B is fine. So let's do another theoretical thought quasi-experiment. So it gets a little worse, it gets a little more sticky here. We deal with quasi-experiments in education because we don't typically randomly assign students to teachers or teachers to classes. So we have teacher A versus teacher B as a mathematics intervention. This is a quasi-experiment. We're taking existing groups, that is classes taught by teacher A versus teacher B, and we're going to select teacher A and teacher B in such a way that they have matched samples on a pretest measure. The composite measure is sensitive to both algebra and geometry, and the scale changes meaning over its range. We have a couple of known impacts. Teacher A is more effective in eliciting growth in geometry. Teacher B is of average effectiveness in eliciting growth in geometry. And teacher A and B are both of average effectiveness in eliciting growth in algebra. So essentially, the results should identify teacher A as the more effective teacher. So these next slides, again, give a graphical representation. So what I'm using is I'm using that algebra geometry composite on the floor of this graph. So here's that curved line is my composite measure of math. And teacher A and teacher B have students who start out in different places because we're using existing groups, but we match the samples. And even though these students start out in very different places in the two classes, when you project those two onto that single composite scale, they end up having a matched sample. So it looks like they started out the same place, even though they didn't. Again, we have, let's see, we have average gains on geometry. We have average gains on algebra. We have average gains on algebra for here, and average gains on geometry, but here's teacher A's value added on geometry. Remember, teacher A has a strong positive value added on geometry, and they're both equally effective on algebra. So here's teacher A's post-test centroid. There's teacher B's post-test centroid, or where teacher A and teacher B's students end up from where they started. You project those down onto the composite scale, and what you have, you actually have an effect in favor of teacher B. So what happened here? Accurate results is teacher A is more effective in eliciting growth in geometry. Teacher A and B are equally effective in eliciting algebra growth. But observed, it says that teacher B is more effective in eliciting math growth. We've actually reversed a finding. We have identified a teacher who, teacher A should be identified as the more effective. The finding actually was that teacher B is more effective. So policy recommendations, we would reward teacher A if we were being accurate. And the observed policy recommendation is that we should reward teacher B. So a summary to this point. This is limited to, thus far, to within grade measures or horizontal scales. So this is a theoretical demonstration that content standards within a content area are multidimensional, an empirical demonstration that there is a content achievement measure that contains multiple dimensions or subscales that behave differently, and it's also a theoretical demonstration that ignoring multidimensionality can distort the results of experiments and quasi-experiments, even to the point of reversing a finding. That's pretty significant. Again, to this point, the presentation has been limited to within grade or horizontal scales, but value-added models in education tend to cover multiple years. They tend to cover multiple grades. They tend to cover broad ranges of achievement, and they cover changing foci of instruction. What do I mean by changing foci of instruction? What I mean is that 6th grade math is very different than 7th grade math. Particularly, 6th grade to 7th grade tends to be the place where students now start studying algebra. You had 0 algebra content in 6th grade and below, and now you have algebra content in 7th grade and above, for example. So to allow for really broad coverage like that, we need cross-grade or vertical or developmental scales. In Florida, they're called developmental scales. So here's a further theoretical counterexample to the unidimensionality assumption. Now we're not talking about one grade, we're talking about grades 3 through 8. So here you see mathematics is not only multidimensional, but the proportional representation of the different dimensions change from grade to grade. Note, especially again, the change from grade 6 to 7. The coverage of algebra raises from 0% to 35% in grade 7. And it seems unreasonable to claim that we're measuring the same thing in every grade here. So this cross-grade change in coverage or meaning is what I call construct shift. And I'm going to introduce you to a couple of some terminology. So there are types of vertical scales. One is purely unidimensional scales. I call purely unidimensional scales scales that measure one and only construct. These are non-construct shifted, non-composite scales. So we might call a number and operation scale might be a purely unidimensional scale. I also have another type that is called empirically unidimensional scales. They measure more than one construct. The proportional representation of the multiple constructs remains the same across grades. Not very reasonable, but we'll work with it. And the scale does not change meaning across grades. So these are non-construct shifted composite scales. Then we come to the really troublesome one. Empirically multidimensional scales, where scales measure more than one construct. The proportional representation of those multiple constructs changes across grades. So the scale changes meaning across grades, and these are construct-shifted composite scales. So the question is, how does construct shift impact the results of growth and value-added models? So I'll show you a mathematical derivation and show you some empirical demonstrations with growth models. So let's say we want to measure the impact of a single teacher, or maybe even a group of teachers using the same instructional method, intervention, on student growth. So let's go ahead and let X in our regression model here represent whether a student is instructed by a certain teacher or by a group of teachers. So we've got some equations here. Don't worry about this too much. This is a simplest growth model. It's a two-level hierarchical linear model. We have measurements within students and we have linear gains. Okay, so what does this mean? This top yellow block is what we think we're measuring. This is what we think our statistical model is doing. This is the best case of what we're actually modeling with an empirically unidimensional measure as the outcome, meaning we're measuring mathematics, but it has multiple dimensions in it, and they stay the same from grade to grade. This is the most likely case of what we are actually modeling with an empirically multidimensional measure as the outcome, and that's even more complex and less like what we think we're modeling. So here are some analogous terms. Here's the overall intercept. This is where kids tend to start out. Here's the effect of teacher X on where kids start out, or essentially, this is kind of looking at how sorted are the students in teacher X's classroom. Here's the overall slope, how fast do kids tend to grow, and here's the effect of teacher X on how fast kids grow. So one of the things you should notice here is that there's a big problem. Up here in the top, the red and the blue are on the intercept equation. The green and the black are on the slope equation. In the bottom, all four of them are on the intercept equation, and all four of them are on the slope equation. So now we've started mixing up the effects of what teachers do. We've got some real significant problems here in that our slope, our impact of what a teacher does in terms of how students grow down here doesn't include just the average growth rate and the impact of teacher X on that growth rate. It also includes where the kids started out. And we were doing a growth model, so we wouldn't have to have that kind of confounding of where kids start out being a part of the growth rate. That's just a big problem. So another problem, the intercept and slope equations from construct shifted scales contain some totally irrelevant terms from the regression of proportional construct representation on time and the regression of time multiplied by proportional representation on time. So we've got these really strange things in here. These are things that you would not expect to be in a model, yet they're in these models of the slopes and the intercepts. So let's go ahead and do this for a really simple case value-added model. This is a two-level model of measurement occasions cross-nested within both teachers and students. All right, what does that mean? It means that we have students that take multiple tests and they see multiple teachers over the 3 years or 4 years that they're in the model. So this is the teacher effect we think we are modeling with a purely unidimensional measure as the outcome. Here's the best case of what we are actually modeling. This is more complex and again less like what we think we're modeling. And here's the most likely case of what we are actually modeling because we're using an empirically multidimensional measure as the outcome or a vertical developmental scale that changes meaning from grade to grade. So what do these things mean? This right here is the impact of teacher A on unidimensional student gains in year I. This is what we want to measure. This is what we're intending to measure. Okay, now we're going to make things a little more complex because we're going to take proportional representation of construct C. For example, number in operations is 40% of the third grade test. It might change to 20% next year. Here's the impact of teacher A on year I student gains on construct C. So what does this mean? This is the impact of teacher A on number and operations as compared to algebra. Here's the year I proportional representation of construct C. So you can see that construct representation changes from year to year. Here's another one. Here's the change in proportional representation of construct C from the previous grade. What on earth is that doing in our model? How much the constructs change from year to year comes into my value-added effect as a teacher. That's a problem. The amount that the construct changes from year to year should be irrelevant to me. We should just be measuring how much I impact student growth. Now here's the one, kind of the kicker. This is the impact of all teachers previous to teacher A on student achievement in construct C. So one of the promises of value-added model is that we're going to isolate the effect of individual teachers. One of the problems when you use a developmental scale that changes content from year to year is that you're adding back in everything that happened before that teacher back into teachers' value-added estimates. So this is definitely relevant. This is what we want. This can be considered relevant with some problems, but this is definitely irrelevant. How much the construct representation changes and how much previous teachers impacted my students' growth, that now enters into my value-added estimate. So we can actually calculate the proportion of variance in teacher effects that is construct relevant in construct shifted scales, in value-added models that use construct shifted scales. So what does that depend on? That depends on, well, actually, before we go there, these numbers in this table are the proportion of teacher effects that are not attributable to prior teachers. So where it's a 1, that's perfect. That's what we want. We want to isolate an individual teacher's effect on his or her students. Where it's 1, it's great. The lower it gets, the worse off we are. So for example, that 0.13 in the very bottom left, that says that 13% of the variance in a teacher's value-added estimate actually comes from that teacher. The rest of it comes from prior teachers or changing construct. So it's a pretty significant change. So what does that depend on? First, it depends on proportional representation of the constructs. The more unbalanced the constructs are within a year, the more prior teachers enter into your score. The more the representation changes from year to year, or the more the meaning of the scale changes from year to year, the more that prior teachers enter into my score. And the number of prior grades in the analysis, meaning the number of teachers that preceded me, the greater the number of teachers that preceded me, the greater the amount of their impact on my value-added score. So one of the things that, and also, it depends on the interconstruct value-added correlation. This is on the population-wide correlation and value-added impacts on the multiple constructs. This is not on the correlation of the constructs themselves. Correlations of multiple constructs tend to be very high. So math, it tends to be, say, for example, related at 0.85 to reading on state tests, something like that. But value-added on math and value-added on reading could be quite different. They could be very lowly correlated. So the proportion of the estimate of my effectiveness that I can impact can drop dramatically depending on my circumstances. So the question is, how much construct-relevant variance is acceptable in teacher effects? So in a research study, I might be able to accept a lot more in a research study than I might accept in a pay-for-performance measure. And if I'm making decisions about hiring, firing, promotion, and tenure, how much of my value-added effect do I want to come from me as opposed to the teachers who came before me? I think that's a good question. Most people will say 1, but we're never going to get to perfection. So how much imperfection is okay? And I'm going to there's an empirical demonstration of the importance of which scale is used that was done by Lockwood and McCaffrey and Hamilton and Stetcher and Lee and Martinez. I'm remembering this, I think. And what they did is they ran value-added measure on 2 math subscales. And the variation in VAM measures across the subscales was actually greater than variation across model specifications. So it mattered more which math subscale they used to model value-added than it mattered how they specified their model. And the variation within teachers across subscales was greater than variation within subscales across teachers. What does that mean? That actually means that I, as a teacher, had greater variation across those 2 subscales than there were within a subscale across teachers. That's pretty significant. Now, this is only one study, so don't take too much from it. It is only one study, but at the same time, the correlation between value added on the 2 subscales was pretty low as well. And what this would mean is, based on the percent variation from construct relevant sources chart, we're down here in the lower end. So they had pretty low interconstruct correlations. We're talking about this area of the chart. From Doran and Cohen, there's also some empirical work that included how much error there is in vertical scaling. And the bias, his conclusion was that the bias in vertical linking is so great that they recommended including uncertainty in the gains arising from vertical linking bias into the results of value-added models. So essentially, even though it's already difficult to tell teachers at the bottom and top apart, there are just a few that you can tell apart from the rest of the pack, that would reduce it further. And they said, consider not using value-added models based on vertical scales to make causal inferences about individual teachers or schools because the data are too noisy. And that was based solely on the type of error that is introduced through vertical scaling. So we're talking about the errors that Dan talked about this morning, we're talking about the errors that come from the measurement side, and we're talking about the errors that come from the equating error side. So we've now got 3 sources of error, and we have 3 different sources of scholars saying, wait a minute, consider not using value-added models based on vertical scaling because of these errors, or not trying to make causal claims. People are saying that about value-added models, and people are saying that from the statistical side as well. So I look at that and I say, I've got people saying that from 4 places, that we need to be really careful how we use value-added model in making causal interpretations about teachers. So, Betsy, how much time do I have at this point? Okay. So summary to this point, when using cross-grade vertical scales, I can show you mathematically that results of growth models are seriously distorted. So slopes contain intercept terms, intercepts contain slope terms. Both intercept and slope contain terms that from totally irrelevant regressions of proportional construct weights on assessment occasions. So we've got these statistical models that are really messed up now if we use a construct shifted scale. And value-added modeling is sensitive to what subconstruct is measured, and there are plenty of cautions against causal interpretations based on measurement issues and statistical issues. So we can also mathematically demonstrate that results of value-added models are seriously distorted, and we've kind of violated the promise of value-added models. We have not isolated teachers the way we thought we were isolating teachers. Individual teacher effects contain terms that include the impact of all teachers that preceded the individual teacher. That fundamentally violates the promise of value-added models, that you're going to isolate individual teachers and say, how much did that particular teacher impact the growth of this group of students? Now we're saying our measure of how much that teacher impacted the growth of individual students or that group of students depends on teachers that came before them. So the impact of all preceding teachers in individual teacher effect terms is amplified by the degree of changes in construct representation in the achievement measure from grade to grade. And you can be harmed by following either poor or excellent teachers, or helped by following either poor or excellent teachers by no fault of your own. It really depends on how the construct representation changes on the test, and it's really difficult to tell whether you're going to be helped or harmed. You have to understand the equations And you have to be really intimate with those equations, and you have to know whether the teacher who came before you was good in terms of value-added modeling or poor in terms of value-added modeling. And you have to know not only whether they're good or poor, but which constructs they're good on and which constructs they're poor on. Really hard to get your head around. So everything to this point has been theoretical, really thought experiments, empirical, but in a limited sense. Counts of content standards covering different subconstructs, identification of nonlinear composite multidimensional scales that go through a multidimensional space, and mathematical. What is missing is a demonstration of major variations in outcomes resulting from growth models using real construct shifted vertical scales and value-added models using real construct shifted vertical scales. I'm going to show you something from the first, not from the second, because it does generalize to the second. So we have an instrument that, our Michigan English Language Proficiency Assessment. We took grades 3 through 5, and it measures 4 domains: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And we're going to treat those individual domains as purely unidimensional. And we're going to do dimensionality analysis based on a method that is more sensitive than traditional dimensionality analysis, and that we put the number of dimensions between 3 and 5 inclusive, so we can say that reading, writing, listening, and speaking are probably pretty close to purely unidimensional. If they're not, it doesn't matter that much because this is just a demonstration, but we're close. So grades 3 through 5 students receive the same assessment. We followed the same cohort of students from grades 3 through 5. We had common items from grade 3 to 4 and from grade 4 to 5. We did common item vertical equating based on non-equivalent groups. So we actually created a vertical scale. And this allows for the best case development of vertical scales because the same level of the test, it was the same level of the test in all 3 grades. We just did equating the way that vertical equating is done. We could have done horizontal equating. We chose to do vertical equating. Thank you. No major differences in item difficulty across the scales. So we did calibration and scaling. We calibrated all items to the same base scale across years using win steps. And we weighted the items to create different types of vertical scales with differing domain contributions. So we created purely unidimensional scales: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So the weights for reading are reading 1, writing 0, listening 0, speaking 0. So we took only the reading items and created a reading scale. Then we created empirically unidimensional scales, for example, equal, text, and oral. So weights for the equal are, we put 0.25 for all of the 4 domains. The weights for the text are that we heavily weighted reading and writing, and we lowly weighted listening and speaking. Then we created empirically multidimensional scales by creating a text to oral. So essentially saying in the lower grade, it's mostly text. In the higher grade, it's mostly oral. And we created oral to text. And we, for example, you can see that we weighted in grade 3 reading and writing heavily. By the time we got to grade 5, it was listening and speaking heavily weighted. So we actually reversed the weights for grades 3 through 5 for oral to text. So we have 15 resulting scales. They're purely unidimensional, empirically unidimensional, and empirically multidimensional scales. And these 2 at the bottom, we did speaking to reading, writing, and listening because one of the things we noticed is that speaking behaves somewhat differently than the rest of the scales. And we know that we have that kind of thing happening based on the empirical demonstration in mathematics. So let's go ahead and create an empirically multidimensional scale where things do behave differently. So here are the correlations among the vertical scales. These are pretty moderate. Listening, reading, writing, and speaking are pretty moderate. The correlations among the empirically unidimensional scales and those original scales are pretty high, very high correlations with a few extreme ones. But here's what's interesting. We have extreme correlations between these empirically multidimensional and empirically unidimensional scales. And what's important here is if you have correlations this extreme and you put them all into a model where they are the outcome, they should behave almost identically. Right? If you have correlations this high among your outcomes, you might as well just create a principal component and put that in as your outcome. So we wanted to see, we looked at these, and those are very high, so what kind of differences do we get in a growth model? So we did a growth model With random student effects, we had student level intercept and slope predicted by demographics. So essentially what we did is we looked at grade to predict your growth rate. We looked at whether you're female, whether you're a Spanish speaker, whether you're an Arabic speaker to predict where you start out and to predict how fast you grow. And here's the results. For the purely unidimensional scales, one of the things we see is that for Arabic students, this is pretty consistent. Arabic students tend to start out low, and they tend to grow at a lower rate across the board. Some inconsistent results. If you're female, you tend to start out lower in listening and tend to start out higher in writing, and so on. You tend to grow at a lower rate in, you tend to grow at a higher rate in everything but reading. So you've got some inconsistent results there. Okay. And here we've got a range of values, the maximum versus the minimum. This shows you how different those coefficients are and the p-values are. And then this indicates whether the sign of the coefficient differed depending on the scale used as the outcome in the model. And these indicate whether at least one scale had statistical significance and another scale did not at the common alpha levels of 0.05, 0.01, and 0.01. So we're looking at how much change happens when you look at these outcomes. And what we're seeing here is what we would expect. You would expect that reading, writing, listening, and speaking would behave somewhat differently for different populations. But now, let's look at the growth model results with composite scales. These, again, remember, these scales are extremely highly correlated. They should behave nearly identically, but they don't, which is a really interesting outcome. What this is saying is, I don't care how highly correlated the status of students is, it's how highly correlated their growth is. And can I have particular interventions or predictors that show differing amounts of impact on student growth over time. And what you see is you see some large range changes, even with extreme correlations among the scales. You see changes in signs of coefficients and in statistical significance interpretations, even with extreme correlations among scales. And here's a really interesting one. Remember that Arabic students consistently grew at a lower rate? Well, on one of our composite scales, a construct shifted one that happens to be, we've reversed the finding. So we've actually reversed the finding. There is no impact of being Arabic on growth rate now for this particular scale. And it all depends on which scale, how we created our scale. So I'm actually, here's policy recommendations. I'm actually going to skip these, but essentially, I'll just do this. If you were going to focus your resources on certain student groups, you would focus startup resources on the students whose intercept was low. You would focus ongoing resources on the students whose slope was low. Well, if you use purely unidimensional, you're always going to focus ongoing resources on Arabic-speaking students. But it's actually missing in one of these composite scales. And we would focus startup resources on males only on writing, but look at how many it shows up in. So we've really changed the outcome of what the policy recommendations would be based on these models, even though they have extreme correlations. So the findings, the real multidimensional picture is it's messy and nuanced. It's not consistent across subscales. And there are real differences in statistical significance and interpretation of these models. And the distorted composite picture is, well, we can't reflect the real picture because we've combined things into a unidimensional scale. If you have differences on the multidimensional scales, a unidimensional scale can't capture those differences. So it's inconsistent even with extremely highly correlated scales, and it sends policy and theory in the wrong direction. So construct shifted scales, vertical scales, can cause serious and practical distortions in the results of growth-based models, including value-added. Non-construct shifted scales, but composite scales, can also cause serious and practical distortions in the results of growth-based models, and it all depends on which scale you choose. And growth model results, including value-added model results, are highly sensitive to unmodeled dimensionality, whether it's construct shifted or not, and whether the constructs are highly correlated or not. So an overall summary, growth and value-added models requiring linear scales that are used for theory development, or policy decisions should avoid the use of composite scales of outcomes. That's pretty tough. Almost every state only has composite scales as outcomes. Growth and value-added models requiring linear scales should be based on as nearly purely unidimensional scales as possible. We need to use more sensitive measures of dimensionality to get there, and we need to trust content expert judgment on what constitutes a dimension or construct. And if one desires to use a composite scale, one should use methods that do not make the assumptions of linearity, unidimensionality, and interval level scaling. For example, in Michigan, we developed a growth model that does not make those assumptions because of these issues. And our Race to the Top submission for teacher evaluations also does not make the assumption that you can just take the value-added model outcome and say, this is a teacher, because of the issues that we've identified here. So here are some references for this talk, and that's all I have. Perfect timing and good opportunity for questions, so I'll let you moderate your questions. Okay.